for tuning in. Much love and respect to everybody, to all the tribes. And again, dodge the hijack. If you're listening right now and you're still holding on to Africa and you haven't shown any proof, just listen to this next. It's gonna be a good some. It's gonna be a lot of information right now that I'm gonna read. And it's called Studies in History, Economics, and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. And it says Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Indian slavery by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. And chapter 2 is Enslavement by the Spaniards. And it begins in their attitude toward the Indians. The Spaniards simply applied the theory of their time regarding slavery. The taking of slaves was then considered part of any expedition of discovery or conquest. So it was a normal thing for the Spaniards to do. It was part of what they did when they so-called discovered something, right? Or when they went into conquest. The high authority of the church sanctioned the institution of slavery to the extent that the leading theologians had declared all barbarous and infidel nations who shut their ears to the truths of Christianity fair objects of rapine, captivity, and slavery. Again, so this is from the high authority of the church, which meant the Vatican, the papal bull they're talking about. If you didn't accept Christ or Jesus, you were a pagan, all right, or an infidel. You were declared a barbarous infidel if you didn't want to hear the truths of Christianity. All right, so because of that, you were open to be put in captivity and slavery. All right, remember, this is a very scholarly article telling you how it really went down. Here, Columbus was the major supplier of American slaves prior to 1500. As noted earlier, he caused some 3,000 to perhaps 6,000 slaves to be sent to Europe, and also, if we are to believe that his plans were implemented to the Azores, Canary, Madeira, and Cabo Verde Islands. By the year 1500, however, a great escalation began in the shipment of Americans across the Atlantic, since other Spaniards and the Portuguese became directly active. In the year 1500, Americans were directly transported to Europe from the Caribbean islands, from the coast of South America, and from the Terra Nova, Newfoundland region, that's up there in Canada. 3 major new sources of slaves were thus opened up, and it is necessary to examine this subject before proceeding to an analysis of what happened to the Americans when they arrived in eastern lands. So right from the beginning, the plan was to enslave the ancestors. They were bringing them to all their colonies, wherever that was in the world, especially over to Europe. As it says here, this is way before the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Or did we just skip all this part of history? Street peasants. So the people he brought here were wild. They didn't give a damn what they were doing. They didn't care. They didn't think twice. They came here and saw riches, women, paradise. All right, that was strategic. Columbus knew what he was doing. He was coming to enslave you, enslave the ancestors. You were gold to him. The general feeling regarding the relation of the Indians to the Spaniards is well expressed by Hernando de Escalante Fontanero, who was with Menendez in Florida as an interpreter. In writing of Florida, he declared it his belief that the Indians can never be made submissive and become Christians. So he advocated that they all be taken, placed on ships, and scattered throughout the various islands and even on the Spanish Main, where they might be sold as His Majesty sells his vessels to the grandees in Spain. You heard that, right? So he's saying, since since they're so hard to enslave, they're never going to be Christians. They're not, they're rebels. They don't want to be, following Christianity. They don't want to be worked. They don't want to be, put in fields or become servants. So let's just enslave them. He's basically telling you, send them to their different colonies, put them in ships. Deuteronomy 28. Place on ships, scattered throughout the various islands, and even on the Spanish Main. What does that mean? The New Spain, and even Europe. Given this attitude on the subject, it was but natural that the enslavement of the American Indians should begin with the discovery of the Antilles, and that it should be continued by the explorers on the mainland. The Spanish exploring expeditions were war expeditions in the sense that they aimed to conquer and retain for the crown the territory through which they passed. All these expeditions, so-called expeditions, captured and retained Indians as slaves. All of them. All these Spaniards were coming here to enslave. They weren't bringing Africans. All these expeditions captured and retained Indians as slaves. Indians, not Africans. Yet in some cases, it might be difficult to determine whether the Indians enslaved were captives taken in actual warfare or whether they were merely kidnapped by the expedition passing through their territory, and they were kidnapped most of the time. Often the expeditions possessed the double character of a war party and a kidnapping company. Continuing the book, Bartolomé de las Casas, his life, his apostolate, and his writings. Says here, the next suggestion, despite any possible excellence of his motives, was a frank proposal to establish a thriving trade in human flesh, as a barefaced as could be made by the least scrupulous black birder. The admiral, always dwelling upon the spiritual welfare of the cannibal natives, proposed that the more of them that could be captured, the better it would be, and then mingling temporal advantages to Spaniards with spiritual blessings to the natives, he explained that the quantities of livestock and other necessaries required by the colonists might be paid for by the sale of slaves sent back to Spain in the ships which would bring these supplies several times a year to the colony. All right, send slaves in ships to Europe. All right, Deuteronomy 28. You've been only looking at one side of the story. The sovereigns are to be reminded that they may collect duties on this slave trade, and an early answer decided in order that the arrangements for the newcomers may be pushed forward. Remember, Columbus was a slave trader before he went to the Americas. During a voyage which resulted in the discovery of Jamaica and other islands, he visited that of San Juan, Puerto Rico, for the purpose of capturing more cannibals. And in the year 1496, Bartholomew Columbus sent 300 natives who were convicted or accused of killing Spaniards to Spain to be sold as slaves. Again, now we're talking about Christopher Columbus' brother. Yes, if you don't know, he had a brother, and this is his name, Bartholomew Columbus. It says Bartholomew Columbus sent 300 natives who were convicted or accused of killing Spaniards to Spain to be sold as slaves. They were bringing American Indians over there and calling them Negros over there when they were selling them. Again, his brother brought 300 of them over there to be sold as slaves. Right, so we already know, the Papa Bulls, 1452, I believe, or 40 something, but it was way before Columbus. All right, Papal bulls given permission, orders to go conquer all the pagans, Saracens, enemies of Christ, or the Vatican or Christianity, right? And take their kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, their palaces, their kings, all that, their land, right? They made it law. They gave a permit, a papal bull, an order. All right, this is the highest order that existed in that time, a papal bull. Right, so you see, they were already coming with a plan. This is way before Columbus. Columbus knew where he was going and what he was about to go do. All right. My desire, Columbus writes during the first voyage, was to pass by no single island without taking possession of it. On occasion, he even offers an island here and there to one of his companions.
It says, thus Columbus, according to Las Casas, was determined to consume the entire population of Haiti by filling every ship with slaves to be sold in the Canary, Azores, and Cabo Verde Islands, or wherever, and planned that these slaves would finance the conquest. They would send the Native Americans from one slave market to another and ended up in these places like Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde was a big slave port, and supposedly a big slave port of where the transatlantic slave trade started. So you see who was over there actually getting sold, right?
Thus, even as Columbus was loading 5 ships with slaves, he was proposing to sell 4,000 in various parts of the Mediterranean and along the coast of Africa. Where? Africa. Who's over there? The shipment of Americans to Europe and Africa by Columbus and by other Spaniards. Again, the shipment of Americans to Europe and Africa, to Africa by Columbus, the other way around, reverse, flip the game on you, and by other Spaniards, was then not an accident, nor was it a result of armed resistance or alleged cannibalism. Those were all lies, you see? They're all lies. They were alleged cannibalism, alleged. It was a direct extension of the style of commercial slavery long practiced by the Genoese and Venetians in the Mediterranean and used by the Portuguese along the west coast of Africa. All right, so Columbus has connects with all those people. Greeks, Genoese, and Portuguese. He was a slave trader. He's been on ships since 14 years old. He was already doing this. This was his game. He was good at it. And that's why they really sent him first and allowed him to go. Titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. All right, Columbia University, 1913. From the beginning of the colony, the settlers of Carolina were in trouble with the Indians. In September 1671, war was declared against the Kuso, a tribe on the southern frontier, who posed as allies of the Spaniards. All right, so this tribe was allied with the Spaniards, the Kuso, and who vexed the Carolina settlers with petty depredations. The Kuso were quickly defeated, and the prisoners sent to be sold out of the colony, unless ransomed by their countrymen. During the war with the Stono Indians in 1680, the captive Indians were brought to Charleston and sold by Governor West to the traders in the colony to be carried to the West Indies as slaves. Again, they, who? Indians, right? Being sent to the West Indies as slaves or servants. We're in the book now. It's called Indian Slaves from Caribana, Trade and Labor in the 17th Century, Caribbean. So the 1600s, right? 1600s. Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. And it says here, abstract, or I guess like the introduction. It says here, indigenous resistance made Caribbean colonization a slow and violent process in the period of 1580 to 1690. All right, again, 1580, 1690. The Caribbean Indians who rejected colonization became targets for enslavement. Slavers captured indigenous people in raids or through trade within indigenous dominated territories. I conceptualize this space as Caribana. Geographically, it stretched from Guyana northward throughout islands of the Lesser Antilles. I focus on the indigenous captives from Caribana who were enslaved in English and Dutch colonies, namely Barbados, Curaçao, and Suriname. I show how colonists justified enslaving indigenous people in the same manner as they justified the transatlantic African slave trade. All right, so she's telling you, just like the so-called transatlantic slave trade, it was happening here way before that. Just like it, despite widespread taboos against the former practice and not the latter. You see? So, because they always acknowledged the latter, right, which is called the transatlantic, but we already know that's in reverse, but they ignore what's happened before the so-called transatlantic slave trade happened. These taboos did not prevent Indian slavery, but they influenced the creation of 17th century histories, government reports, and other material for public and European consumption. Indian slavery has thus been written about, then and now, as limited phenomenon wherein Indians had limited and specific labor roles, example as fishermen or domestic servants, indentured servants, encomenda. However, sources such as deeds and tax rolls show that more Indian slaves than assumed contributed a broad range of skills to plantations economies. So more Indian slaves assumed, meaning more than what they have told us, actually contributed to a broad range of skills to plantation economies. English Barbados was exceptionally successful because it was geographically separate from the conflicts that created captives in Caribana, but nevertheless extracted Indian slaves from the region. Meanwhile, colonies abutting Caribana, such as Suriname, faced trade sanctions from neighboring Indians and rebellions if they abused the Indian slave trade. Indian slave trade. From 1670s to 1690s, colonial governments limited the means of accessing Indian slaves, but once enslaved, they faced the same restrictive black codes. You hear this? Black codes that allowed the brutal treatment of them as inheritable chattel. All right, we're just talking about American Indians, not Africans. So again, we're still in the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. Again, this is Studies in History, Economics and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia. The chief, though not the earliest, source of Indian slaves, so the chief source of Indian slaves among the French was that of captives taken in war with the Indian tribes. For many years after the coming of the French to Louisiana, they and the Natchez Indians lived in friendly intercourse. Minor Indian troubles in 1711 and 1715 resulted in the enslavement and transportation of certain Indians to Cape Francois on the island of Haiti. All right, so where are these Indians? The descendants of these Indians in Haiti. All right, we know who's there. All right, the hostilities begun with the Natchez Indians in 1715 continued intermittently until 1740. In 1730, because of ill treatment by M. du Chappard, governor of Fort Rosalie, who wished the site of a Natchez village on which to build a town, and because of other abuses, the Natchez rose against the French and massacred over 200 of them. All right, so the Natchez weren't having it. They were trying to take their land, everything away from them. Right, so they were not having it, and they killed over 200 of them, it says here. Continuing, Governor Perrier formed an army and advanced against them in their fort. The Natchez offered to leave the place if their lives were spared. So they decided, all right, they're going to kill us, so let's just give them the land and so we can survive. Their offer was accepted, but they were detained as prisoners. So even though they accepted their offer, they still detained them as prisoners. All but 20 who escaped. So all of them became prisoners. We're talking about the whole Natchez Nation Indians, right? Only 20 of them escaped. About 450 of the tribe, including their great son, the little son, and several of the principal war chiefs, were captured and carried to New Orleans. All right, you hear this, right? The women and children were retained as slaves on the plantations. Who? The Natchez, not Africans, were retained as slaves on the plantations. Some of the prisoners were burned in New Orleans. The great son, the little son, their families, and more than 400 of the captives were sent at once to Cape Francois, Haiti, and most of them sold to the planters as slaves. Again, right? The primary families, the chiefs, the war chiefs, the great son and little son, and their families, along with 400 of their captives. We're talking about the Natchez tribal people. Were sent to where? Haiti. All right, we know they were sent to the Caribbean. Now we know exactly where. Haiti. So is a lot of the Haitians Natchez people? Yes, they are. All right. Again, once they got there, most of them sold to the planters as slaves. All right. So these are the slaves. These aren't Africans. The two chiefs and their families were retained as prisoners on the island of Haiti, right? On April 22nd, 1731, the minister informed the company that, in his opinion, the only solution of the matter lay in selling as slaves the survivors of the two families. They were too much trouble for them. So they said the only solution is selling them as slaves. All right, in Haiti, the Natchez, war chiefs, and their families. The registers of the company contain the following record. It was resolved to order the sale of the survivors of the said two families of Natchez Indians. He knew.
In any case, at least 3,000 Americans are known to have been shipped to Europe between 1493 and 1501, with the likely total being possibly double that. Most were sent to Seville area, where they seemed to show up in the slave markets as Negros, without a place of origin being mentioned. Others were probably sold in the Azores and other islands, right? Cape Verde, partly to avoid the wrath of Queen Isabel, who on occasion expressed hostility towards the dividing up of her vessels without her prior permission.
The enslavement of the Indians by the Spaniards in the early years of occupation was legalized by a royal decree which declared the act to be in accord with the laws of God and man, and justified it on the ground that Indians could otherwise not be reclaimed from idolatry and converted to Christianity. Consistent with its assertion, the home government made careful provision in the various patents issued to the explorers for the spiritual welfare of the enslaved Indians. These patents commonly made provisions for the acquisition of Indian slaves. That a Ponce de Leon, February 23, 1512, authorizing his voyage of discovery and colonization, provided that the Indians on the islands he might discover should be distributed among the members of the expedition, that the discoverers should be well provided for in the first allotment of slaves, and that they should derive whatever advantage might be secured thereby. The cedula issued to Lucas Vasquez de Leon, this is very important, in 1523 authorized him to purchase prisoners of war held as slaves. Lucas Vasquez de Leon, remember that name, by the natives, to employ them on his farms and export them as he saw fit. With the taking of captives by force and then Christianizing them was the continuation of what was known as the exercise of a just and pious doctrine against pagans and heathens. All right, that's how they saw you. A doctrine common to other nations as well as to Spain. They would make good and industrious servants. They are fit to be ruled. These are all, we got all this. We got the books. We got his letters. He said all this. In order to remain consistent, Columbus establishes subtle distinctions between innocent, potentially Christian Indians and idolatrous Indians practicing cannibalism, and between Pacific Indians submitting to his power and bellicose Indians who thereby deserve to be punished. But the important thing is that those who are not already Christians can only be slaves. There is no middle path. Hence, he foresees that the ships that transports herds of cattle from Europe to America, so they will bring cattle, will be loaded with slaves on the return journey. All right? So you hear that, right? That's the business. This is the real slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, so called, right? Where did it begin? Which way did it begin? We have the records of the people being brought over there, the plans. We got the Popol Vuh. We got everything to show you It happened in reverse. Again, they were bringing ships loaded with herds of cattle, and these ships were going back where? On the return journey, back where? To Europe. Back to Europe with what? With slaves. Where did they get these slaves? Where were they? They were in America, not Africa. These same slaves would be sold all over the world from there. Seville, Lisbon, places like that, Castile were slave markets, huge slave markets. Go do the research during those times so you can see what I'm talking about. And you can see that when they were bringing these so-called Indians, right, your ancestors, over there, they were selling them as Negros in the records over there. All right, go research that. And regular raids were organized upon tribes and villages on the pretext that a chief had not performed the services required in lieu of tribute and had fled with his people to the forest. Pursuit followed, and all who were captured were considered rebels, taken in open fight, and were immediately dispatched in the vessels of Columbus' fleet, which had reached Hispaniola in August of 1498 to be sold as slaves in Spain. Slaves, who? American Indian Columbus was taken back on his vessels. His brothers, all these people that were coming with him, they were all enslaved. Still invoking the name of the Holy Trinity, Columbus explained to the sovereigns that he could supply as many slaves as the Spanish market required, estimating according to his information that 4,000 could be disposed of, the value of whom together with that of a shipment of logwood would amount to 40 million maravedis. The consignment mentioned consisted of 600 slaves, of whom one-third was given to the masters of the ships to cover the carrying charges. After 2 years of dissensions, Roldan and his rebellious supporters were pacified, and Columbus partitioned lands and slaves among them with unstinted generosity. So, as when they got their slaves too, they stopped complaining and protesting against Columbus. Those of Roldan's adherents who elected to remain in the colonies received from the admiral repartimientos, consisting of a certain number of hillocks of casabe, the plant from which flour for cassava bread was made, yuca we call it, which were placed in charge of cacique, whose people were obliged to till them for the profit of the holder. So, who was growing the food and who was eating it? What happened in the plantations and slavery in America. Same thing was going on here way before that. This was the second stage in the development of repartimientos. This is what they call it, repartimientos, or a plantation. The Indians were bound to the land and forced to cultivate it. 15 of the Roldan party, however, decided to return to Spain, each of whom received from 1 to 3 slaves, whom they took back with them in October 1499. All right, we're going to read from this article in this journal. It's called Indian Slavery in Colonial Georgia by Rodney M. Bain. This is from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, Volume 79, Number 2, summer of 1995, pages 418 to 424. Of course, slavery was not a new concept by the time the English colonized the coast of southeastern North America, nor had it been introduced by the Spanish who preceded them. Slavery had long been a way of life among the various Indian nations, but the practice was much expanded during the 17th and 18th centuries, when thousands of southeastern Indians were captured by warring tribes and marauding whites were sent into bondage farther north or in the West Indies, far removed from their own tribes. All right, and it's titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. All right, Columbia University, 1913. The breaking out of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701 gave Governor Moore, a chance to attack the Spanish Indians, capture and sell them under the excuse of the rules of war. Therefore, in 1702, he led a force of militia and Indians against St. Augustine, burned the city, and carried off as slaves whatever Indians he could obtain from the Spanish Indian villages along the way. A second attack on St. Augustine was made by Moore in 1704 with the purpose of destroying missions and carrying off slaves. An advance into the territories of the Apalachee resulted in the destruction of several missions. and the capture of more than 1,000 Indians, some free, some slave. Nearly all the Appalachi were distributed as slaves among the Carolina settlers. All right? Now see who they're putting in these plantations, right? The Carolinas. All right? The enslavement of Indians indeed was carried on wholesale. A letter to the proprietors, July 10, 1708, states that the garrison of St. Augustine is by this war reduced to the bare walls, their cattle and Indians' towns, all consumed, either by us in our invasion of that place or by our Indian subjects. They have driven the Floridians to the islands of the Cape, have brought in and sold many hundreds of them, and many now continue that trade, so that in some 5 years they'll reduce the barbarians to a fearless number. They're talking about American Indians. In 1708, Colonel Barnwell of South Carolina made an expedition to the Appalachian province of Florida. It is thought that this was the time when Captain Naim of South Carolina, with a party of Yamasee Indians, advanced to the vicinity of Lake Okeechobee and brought back a number of captive Indians as slaves. A similar expedition of Colonel Palmer in 1727 against the Yamasee resulted in the destruction of many Indian towns, the slaughter of many natives, and the carrying off of great numbers to Charleston as slaves. All right, so we're at Charleston. We know Charleston was a big slave port, basically where a lot of the American Indians were sent out to other parts of the world. We're talking about including Europe and West Africa. All right. As the result of the three expeditions sent by South Carolina from 1702 to 1708 against the Yamasee, Appalachee, and Timucua of northern Florida, there was carried back to Charleston for sale as slaves almost the entire population of 7 towns in all, some 1,400 persons. All right. And they'll tell you when you try to look for a lot of these tribes, which I learned about recently, the Timucua, right? These are tribes they never teach you about, right? But yeah, they're like, oh, what happened? They disappeared, or they exterminated. But you see what happened, really. All right, how many times did this happen that they got invaded, and then there's 1,400 now, and then another 1,400, here and there. Eventually, they blend in with other tribes, or they become, servants in plantations, and that's what really happened. Those are your ancestors, all right, so-called Negroes. The captives taken in 1715, when the Yamasee and Creek Indians made a foray upon the South Carolina frontier, were sold as slaves. All right, Mr. Johnston, a South Carolina missionary of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts, in his letter to the Society, December 19, 1715, states, "It is certain many of the Yamusees and Creek Indians were against the war all along, but our military men were so bent upon revenge and so desirous to enrich themselves by making all the Indians slaves that fall into your hands." Throughout the Tuscarora War in North Carolina, Indian captives were retained or sold as slaves. At the beginning of military operations following the Indian Massacre of 1711, the friendly Indians agreed to help the English against their enemy upon promise of a reward of 6 blankets for each man killed by them, and the usual price of slaves for each woman and child delivered as captives. During the course of the war, several hundred Indian allies were used by the English, and these allies took advantage of the opportunity to obtain large number of Indian captives to sell to the slave traders of the time. All right, you hear that? In an attack on an Indian fort in 1711, 39 women and children were captured and disposed of in the settlements as slaves. The 2 chief expeditions during the war were those of Colonel Barnwell, who was sent by South Carolina in January 1712, and of Colonel Moore in January and February of 1713. Colonel Barnwell's expedition took 200 Indian women and children prisoners. The expedition of Colonel Moore virtually ended the war by capturing the fort in which the Tuscarora had taken refuge. 900 men, women, and children were killed or taken prisoners. And that's again what we really are, prisoners of war, POWs, not descendants of slaves. In both expeditions, the Allied Indians secured as many as possible of the captured Indians whom they took along with them to sell as slaves in Charleston. And they still further increased their supply of slaves by attacking the peaceful Indians along the route of their return to South Carolina. During the course of the war, more than 700 Indians were sold into slavery. All right, you see number 9 there, footnote. You want to go read it? It says Bassett, John Hopkins University Studies. All right, page 73. Go read it if you want.
Now we're in uncommonwealth.virginiamemory.com. Says here the Uncommon Wealth, Voices from the Library of Virginia Archives. All right. Says here hundreds of the descendants of Indians have obtained their freedom. Freedom suits in the 18th and 19th century Virginia. All right, quick article here we're going to read. A small slip of paper on display in the Library of Virginia's latest exhibition, You Have No Right, Law, and Justice in Virginia, running 24 September 2012, 18 May 2013, all right, this is a little old, was of immense importance to 12 people. It discloses, even though it does not state the fact in so many words, that on 2 May 1772, they gained their freedom after being held in slavery, since each of them was born. The piece of paper and the fates of those Virginians illuminates a disturbing and little-known part of Virginia's history: the enslavement of American Indians. The paper came into the possession of the Library of Virginia in 1988 when it acquired a copy of Volume 2 of John Tracy Atkins' Reports of Cases Argued and Determined in the High Court of Chancery in the time of Lord Chancellor Hardwicke, London 1765 to 1768. It had once been in the library of the colonial government in Williamsburg. One of the librarians in the cataloging section showed it to me, knowing of my interest in that library. When she lifted it from her desk to hand it to me, a piece of paper that had been slipped between leaves in the middle of the volume fell out and fluttered to the floor. We were surprised, and I was even more surprised when I saw what it was. It was a 1780s or 1790s copy of the judgment in Robin versus Hardaway, or Robin or Hardaway, an unusual important case decided in the General Court of Virginia. The librarian and I presented the judgment to the archivist, who added it to the meager surviving records of the Colonial General Court. The court case had two parts. First, attorney argued about whether a 1682 law that allowed for the lifetime enslavement of Indians imported from other colonies had been repealed in 1684, 1691, or 1705. For decades, Virginia's courts had assumed that the 1684 invalidated the 1682 law, and under that persuasion, one of the attorneys informed the court hundreds of the descendants of Indians have obtained their freedom on actions brought in this court. The court concluded the first part of the case by deciding that the 1682 law had remained in effect until 1705. This decision enlarged the number of residents of Virginia who could not hope to gain their freedom by claiming to be descendants of Indian women illegally enslaved between 1684 and 1705. A jury trial then established that the 12 people were descendants of an Indian woman who had been illegally enslaved. The jury awarded Robin, Hannah, Daniel, Cuffy, Isham, Moses, Peter, Judy, Audrey, Sylvia, Davy, and Ned, all of unstated age, 1 shilling in damages. Each received 1 penny, but each also received freedom. Some excellent 21st century scholarship demonstrate that English-speaking Virginians enslaved many more Indian residents of Virginia in the 17th century than earlier historians believed, all right? It wasn't Africans. Oh, they told us it was Africans, but look what they found when they started actually going into the scholarship, going into the records. Oh, actually, Indians got enslaved more than we actually believed, and that the enslavement may very well taken place in spite of the laws or in the absence of laws governing the enslavement of Indians. All right, so again, before we continue, I just want to emphasize all these court cases. We go over this in my videos from Indigenous American to African American, a lot of different examples and how this was going on in different states and different periods of time. So make sure to go ahead and watch those videos. If you have not, again, highly recommend it. Continuing, it says here, because almost all the records of the Colonial General Court burned in the fire that destroyed the state courthouse in much of the business district of Richmond in April 1865. Oh, how convenient that this building burned, right? How convenient they burned this building. That would prove that all these people are Indian. The specific record of the outcome of the important 1772 freedom suit naming the person's freed is especially rare and valuable. Continuing, we're in the Case Law Access Project, Harvard Law School. We're just talking about Bud versus Rachel. This is from March 5th, 1814, Supreme Courts of Appeals of Virginia. Bud versus Rachel and others. All right, so this is the digitized form. We're going to go to a document that it actually has here. All right, and it says here Bud versus Rachel and others. It says slaves, American Indians. A Native American Indian brought into Virginia since the year 1691 could not lawfully be held in slavery here, notwithstanding such Indian was a slave in the country from which he or she was brought. This was a suit for freedom by the appellees against the appellant in the Superior Court of Law for Norfolk County. At the trial, the defendant tendered a bill of exceptions, which was signed and sealed, stating that the plaintiffs claimed their freedom upon the ground of their being the descendants of Papoose, a Native American female Indian, Papoose, who was brought into Virginia about the year 1747, and moved the court to instruct the jury that no Native American Indian brought into Virginia since the year 1691 could under any circumstance be made a slave. All right, that was law. And then even if they're saying 1705, she was brought 1747, so that was even after 1705. So it's law. They shouldn't be slaves. All right, this was an Indian woman, okay? Which instruction the court did give, whereupon the defendant, who claimed to hold the plaintiffs as slaves, upon the ground that, though they were alleged to be descendants of the said Papoose, a Native American Indian, the said Indian was alleged to be a slave and held as such in the island of Jamaica. Okay? American Indians from all over the Americas, not just North America, but were being sent to Jamaica. It was a major hub for Indian slavery, a lot of the sugar plantations. It wasn't Africans they were supplying this with, it was actually American Indians and black Europeans, the prisoners of war. Remember, the Jacobites were sent to plantations, all this stuff. So you guys got to remember all this. But very interesting here is that they're saying Papoose was being held in Jamaica as a slave, all right, even though she was an American Indian. So she had come in from Jamaica into Virginia in 1747, and her descendants now are fighting for their freedom, saying, hey, she was never so-called African or a slave. She was an American Indian. So by their own laws in Virginia, they could not be held as slaves. So she was held in Jamaica, it says, by the wife of Mr. Ivy, and brought by the said Ivy into Virginia as a slave about the year 1747. Moved the court to instruct the jury that a Native American Indian held in Jamaica as a slave under the laws of that island and imported into Virginia by her proprietor in that year 1746 or 1747 might be lawfully held as a slave in Virginia, notwithstanding such person was a Native American Indian, which instruction the court refused to give, to which opinion of the court the defendant accepted. Verdict and judgment for the plaintiffs, from which the defendant appealed. All the acts before 1691 describe particular Indians such as friendly, neighboring, and other restrictive phrases. But the Act of 1691 uses the words of exceptions to have been a Native American Indian, carried from this country to Jamaica, and brought hither from that island. So you see that? So she was originally from North America. She was originally from North America anyway, so they had to give her freedom. They had to respect that. They were trying to make her a slave. They're like, no, but she was a slave in Jamaica, so it doesn't matter. She wasn't from here. But look at that. She was made a slave here in Virginia, probably because she was sent to Jamaica as a slave, right? As we just heard in the documentary, many Indians were being enslaved, right, and sent to the Caribbean. This was one of them. And she had made her way back to Virginia, right? Now, again, it says here the Indian woman Papoose is declared by the Bill of Exceptions to have been a Native American Indian, carried from this country to Jamaica, and brought hither from that island. We had no right to declare Papoose free in Jamaica, but we had the right to say that when brought into our territory, she should be free. All right? And it's not an African, she's an American Indian from Virginia. We're in the Smithfield Review now, volume 12, 2008. It says here Indian Slavery and Freedom Suits, the cases of Rachel Vinnie and Rachel Finley. Although we often think of Negro slaves obtaining their freedom under certain circumstances, it is also true that some Indians, what's the difference, right? In Virginia, who were slaves, obtained their freedom. Many of them used the court system in Williamsburg, especially in the 1770s when a multitude of cases were heard. This article tells the story of two women, residents of Southwest Virginia, who obtained their freedom through the local court systems. Rachel Vinnie in 1815 and Rachel Finley in 1820. In the two specific cases mentioned in this article, one was filed in Montgomery County and the other in Whitty County, Virginia. Each of the petitioners was named Rachel, one with the surname Vinnie, the other Finley. Each had been freed by a court in Eastern Virginia, but since these records have not survived, exact details are unknown. Oh, they don't survive, huh? You burned them, you destroyed them, or you just hiding them? Even though the slaves had obtained their freedom, their masters moved them westward, where they were sold illegally as Negro slaves. Again, who? Remember, these are Indians, and they were sold as what? And illegally selling them as Negro slaves. As a result, the two Rachels had to file freedom suits to try once more to gain their freedom. They had to go to court again. You guys hear that? They already had won their freedom. Rachel Vinnie and 18 other members of her family were from Northumberland County, Virginia, and her first case was held in the District Court for Richmond, Westmoreland, Lancaster, and Northumberland, where they recovered their freedom by verdict dated September 7, 1791. In addition to their freedom, they were awarded 1 shilling in damages. These facts were recited in the case filed in Montgomery County on December 23, 1806, when for the second time Rachel filed for her freedom. The evidence showed that her ancestor was Mary, who had come into Eastern Virginia by ship with her granddaughter Bess. They were identified as Indians, not Africans. Again, I'm going to repeat that because you didn't hear. They were identified as Indians, not Africans, and were described as being of yellow complexion and had long straight hair down to their waist. Bess was a young girl of 12 or 13. No Indian tribe was mentioned. Rachel Vinnie was a child of Sarah, a descendant of these two Indian women. The case stated that she had been sold back into slavery as a Negro. She was purchased by Henry Patton, of a well-known family who lived in that part of Montgomery County that is now Pulaski County. Her petition was filed in March 1807 without fees or costs because she was classified as a pauper. She filed for trespass, assault and battery, and false imprisonment, which was the standard request in such cases. Not only was she suing for her own freedom, but she was also petitioning the court for her children, Hannah, Shanty, Jimmy, Abigail, Joe, and Solomon, all of whom were being held illegally by Henry Patton. In addition, she sued for her son Marcus, who was in the possession of Samuel Patton, a son of Henry, and her son Jupiter, who was in the possession of Andrew Johnston of Giles County. Her daughter Hannah's 3 children, Sam, Daniel, and William, were also included in the suit. After more than 8 years in the court system, all were declared to be free in 1815. In 1816, the Giles County list of free persons of color included Rachel Vinnie, age 49, then living in the New River at Phyllis Peters Place. The other Rachel, identified as Rachel Finley, had a similar experience. She was declared to be free the first time in 1773 by the court in Williamsburg. She claimed her descent from her grandmother named Chance from the matrilineal line. who was brought into Virginia by Indian trader Henry Clay of what is now Powhatan County. All right, Indian trader, Indian slave trader. Based on uncertain evidence, Chance was approximately 6 years old and had been kidnapped by Clay somewhere in southern Indian nations. Catawba, Choctaw, and Creek were all mentioned. All right. But when you look at the place, I'm gonna tell you guys now. When you understand where she got kidnapped from, when we're talking about Virginia, we're most likely talking about Catawba. Rachel Finlay, the granddaughter of Chance, was illegally transferred about 1773 to the frontier of Virginia by Mitchell Clay of Powhatan. She was then 20 years old, and her daughter Judy was 6. They lived in the remote parts of what is now West Virginia, at the place later known as Princeton. The following year, Rachel and Judy were sold as Negro slaves to John Draper, who lived in Draper's Valley, in that part of Whitty County that became Pulaski. All right. So again, and I want you guys to really pay attention to what I'm about to say here, and especially those who are doing genealogy and get confused when they find probates and wills, and when they're saying, "Oh, I give you to my daughter, you know, my Negro slave, you know, Enrique, whatever name they have," because as you can see here in this article, they sold Rachel and Judy as Negro slaves to John Draper. So if you would read a probate or a will that included Rachel and Judy as Negro slaves, you would never imagine. Most people would consider automatically that these are African slaves, and that's not the case. This is something very important to look out for. And don't think these are white people who are doing this and selling the people. Again, this is indentured servitude, and they were doing this to American Indians and other unwanted Europeans. They were doing it to their own people. This is what they were doing in Europe before they got here. Eventually, the case was transferred to Powhatan, and in May 1820, after 7 years in the court system, she was once again declared a free person. She had to fight for all these years just to prove who she was. Not only did Rachel Finley file her case for freedom, but 30 of her 42 descendants can be identified in various lawsuits which followed. Okay? So again, you got slaves going to court and suing their masters. Lawsuits. You guys understand? That slavery narrative they gave us in school is all false. Break the spell.
On at least one occasion, Columbus sent a raiding party ashore to capture some women with their children to keep his growing excess of captured natives, males, company, because he wrote in his journal his past experience in abducting African slaves had taught him that the Indian man would behave better in Spain with women of their country than without them. You see you hear this, right? Because of his experience of slave trading already in that side of the world before he came to America, he knew, he's telling them, we gotta bring the women too. That way they'll keep them happy. I guess he's saying they'll at least be able to have sex, make love, whatever to your wife. At least you won't be so depressed, whatever. But he knew, based on what he was doing before he came there, that it was better to take the women too with the men, On this date, he also records the vignette of the husband of one of these women and father of 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, who followed his capture family onto Columbus' ship and said that if they had to go, he wished to come with them, and begged me hard, and they all now remain consoled with him. But not for long, as a harbinger of things to come, only a half-dozen or so of those many captured native slaves survived the journey to Spain, and of them only 2 were alive 6 months later. On his second voyage, Columbus tried an even more ambitious kidnapping and enslavement scheme. It is described by an Italian nobleman, Michele de Cuneo, who accompanied Columbus on this voyage. Now it says here Michele de Cuneo, or Michael de Cuneo, a member of the second expedition, has left one of the rare accounts describing in detail how the slave trade functioned at its inception. Beginning. His narrative permits us no illusions as to how the Indians were perceived. When our caravels were to leave for Spain, we gathered in our settlement 1,600 male and female persons of these Indians. and of these we embarked in our caravels on February 17, 1495, 550 souls, 550 Indians they stuffed in the caravels in 1495 among the healthiest males and females. For those who remained, we let it be known in the vicinity that anyone who wanted to take some of them could do so, to the amount desired. So they sent 550 with them on the ships back to Europe, Cape Verde, West Africa, and they left a lot behind, right? And they said to all the colonists who were there, settlers, right? Encomenderos they call them, basically slavers, plantation owners, basically. Requerimiento they called the land, requerimientos, these were the plantations. All right, they said, hey, you guys can grab the rest, as much as anyone that desired it, which was done. And when each man was thus provided with slaves, there still remained about 400 to whom permission was granted to go where they wished. Among them were many women with children still at suck, since they were afraid that we might return to capture them once again, and in order to escape us the better, they left their children anywhere on the ground and began to flee like desperate creatures. And some fled so that they found themselves at 7 or 8 days distance from our community at Isabella, beyond the mountains and across enormous rivers. Consequently, they will henceforth be captured only with great difficulty. So eventually, they all were captured or they all died from disease. Such is the beginning of the operation here. This is the beginning. We're talking about the real slave trade of the operation here. Now is the conclusion. But when we reached the waters of Spain, around 200 of these Indians died. So on the way to Spain, 200 died. I believe because of the unaccustomed air, which is colder than theirs. So they froze to death. We cast them into the sea. They threw them in the sea, 200 of your ancestors. We had disembarked all the slaves, half of whom were sick. So there was still like 350 left, right? And half of them were sick. No one knows what happened to those 600 or so left over natives who were enslaved on the admiral's orders by whoever wanted them, or the 400 or so who fled in terror, or their abandoned infants. But by the time Columbus' ships entered the waters outside Spain, of the 550 captured Indians he took with him, 200 had died, says Cuneo. We cast them into the sea. When they reached Cadiz, half of the remaining 350 slaves were sick and dying. Only a relative few survived much longer. Because Cuneo surmised they are not working people and they very much fear cold, nor have they long life. A Spanish ship sailing under Esteban Gomez, a Portuguese, in 1525, coasted along the shores of North America between Nova Scotia and Florida. Nova Scotia also was known as Terra Nova, seeking the Northwest Passage, and carried a few Indians back to Spain. So he kidnapped Indians and brought them to Spain. This Esteban Gomez. And I think this is important because in their records in Spain, Gomez is known to have had Negro slaves. But these were from Nova Scotia and Florida. In 1539, Soto himself landed in the Bay of Espiritu Santo in Florida for the purpose of conquest. He had served under Pizarro in Peru, and his methods were those learned from his master. So remember, Hernando or Fernando de Soto, right? He was under Pizarro when they conquered the Inca. And Pizarro was ruthless, cruel. So De Soto learned from his master, it says here. To ensure success, all opposition must be overcome. So with the expedition were taken bloodhounds, chains, and iron collars for the catching of holding of Indian slaves. Again, chains and iron collars. Iron collars for who? For Indian slaves, not Africans. The Spanish were not enslaving Africans. They were enslaving American Indians. I can't emphasize this enough. perspective, orientation, the true slave trade. In reverse, the expedition was military in nature, hence it was natural that force and conquest should precede conciliation. There is no doubt that one of the purposes of Soto was to capture Indian slaves. He had chosen as his lieutenant a rich resident of the town of Trinidad in Cuba, Vasco Porcayo de Figueroa, who had come to Florida with the object of obtaining Indian slaves for his estates. All right, so remember, De Soto came in with 600 soldiers. All right, 600 soldiers. This included Moranos, Moriscos, black conquistadors too, not just Spanish white looking Europeans. Soto himself was a slave owner. Among his possessions in Cuba were Indian slaves, whom he employed as herdsmen and in getting gold. In some cases, the Indian chiefs through whose territories Soto and his men were passing furnished slaves. All right, everywhere they were passing, De Soto and his 600 men through their expedition in North America, all the way to the Mississippi from Florida. At other times, they both men and women were taken by force. Narrators relate the capture and distribution of such women in groups of 100 to 300 American Indian women enslaved. Among the captives were a queen and a cacique. I have sent men to a house on the west bank of the river. They have brought me back 7 head of women, girls and adults, and 3 infants. You see, they were just going to the village and kidnapping and enslaving babies, women, little girls, older women. All right? To be an Indian and a woman to boot immediately puts you on the same level as cattle. The Indian slaves, with that, he's saying the 8th plague was the slaves, whom the Spaniards made in order to put them to work in the mines. At first, those who were already slaves of the Aztecs were taken, then those who had given evidence of insubordination, finally all those who could be caught. During the first years after the conquest, the slave traffic flourished. Again, during the first years after the conquest, not discovery, conquest, the slave traffic flourished. Popol Vuh. Grab all these pagans, these enemies of Christ, and make them perpetual servants. They made it a law, an edict, a Popol Vuh. You have to follow it. They had permission, they had the laws, everything backing them up. Again, during the first years of their conquest, the slave traffic flourished, and slaves often changed master. They produced so many marks on their faces, in addition to the royal brand, that they had their faces covered with letters. Man, so many letters looked like they had tattoos. So many, they was tattooed up, but they was burnt, right? Branded with letters in their face. For they bore the marks of all who had bought and sold them. Bought and sold them. Vasco de Quiroga, in a letter to the Council of the Indies, has also left a description of these faces transformed into illegible books, like the victims' bodies in Kafka's penal colony. They are marked with brands on the face, and in their flesh are imprinted the initials of the names of those who are successively their owners. They pass from hand to hand, and some have 3 or 4 names, so that the faces of these men, who were created in God's image, have been, by our sins, transformed into paper. Their faces became paper. They were just branding them all over the place in their faces. Can you imagine that? Wow. The earliest of the slave-producing wars in New England was that with the Pequot in 1637. The war consisted of 2 battles, the Mystic Fight and the Swamp Fight. In the first, these 2 events, but 7 captives were taken. In the second, the Swamp Fight, about 180 captives were taken. 2 of the Sakem, taken in the Swamp Fight were spared, on promise that they guide the English to the retreat of Sasakus. The other men captives, some 20 or 30 in number, were put to death. The remaining captives consisted of about 80 women and children. So they kept the women and children, were divided. Some were given to the soldiers, whether gratis or for pay does not appear. 30 were given to the Narragansett, who were allies with the English. 48 were sent to Massachusetts, and the remainder were assigned to Connecticut. The women and girls of the Massachusetts captives were distributed among the towns. It seems probable that Connecticut made a similar disposition of its share of the captives regardless of sex. The male children among the Massachusetts captives were ordered by the Massachusetts General Court in 1637 to be carried to the Bermudas by William Pierce and sold there as slaves. Indian children, not Africans, were sent, right, to the Bermudas, right, and they were sold there as slaves. The shipload of Indians, however, consisting of 15 boys and 2 women, was taken by Captain Pierce to the West Indies instead of to the Bermudas, and disposed of at the island of Providence. Big one right there. All right, so these Pequot, right, they were sent to Providence Island. This is off the coast of Honduras, Nicaragua, around there, in between, from those countries, and Jamaica, and a lot of those people ended up with the mosquitoes, or mosquito people, and they're supposed to be Africans, but we know, if you saw part 3 of this, series, right, we know it was actually American Indians that they were taken there. And these same Pequot, they were called cannibal Negroes. They were calling them in another book. We can show you that. Cannibal Negroes. All right, so one Pequot seized near Block Island was sent to England. It is possible that this single cargo of women and children was not the only one sent to the islands at this time. A letter from the Company of Providence Islands, replying from London July 3rd, 1638, to letters from authorities on the island and directing that special care be taken of the cannibal Negroes brought from New England. What did I just tell you? And I didn't know this was on this book too. All right? But I just told you, and I was going to show you the actual book this is written. This is quoted from. I have it. But you can see it right now. I ain't going nowhere. All right, so it says, again, this letter said, yo, you need to take special care of these cannibal Negroes brought from New England. They're talking about Pequots, American Indians. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a similar disposal of captives was accomplished. On one occasion, about 200 were transported and sold. There is extant a paper written by Daniel Gooking in 1676, one item of which is as follows. And it says, a list of the Indians, children, that came in with John of Pakakuhi. The list shows 21 boys and 11 girls distributed throughout the colony. With the close of the war after Philip's death, many of the Indian chiefs were executed at Boston and Plymouth, and most of the remaining chiefs with their captives followers were sold and shipped off as slaves outside the colonies. Those transported were carried to various parts: the Spanish West Indies, Spain, Portugal, Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores. All right? See all the places where American Indians were sent to be servants or so-called slaves, right? Spanish West Indies, right? The West Indies, Spain, right? Europe, Portugal. We're talking about Seville and Lisbon. These were huge slave markets, especially for American Indians. Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores. Indian slaves from Caribana. Trade and labor in the 17th century, Caribbean, so the 1600s, right? Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. All right, so now we're really in the introduction, I guess. So it says here, in 1668, a member of Charles II's Trade Council, and read up on that, the Trade Council, Benjamin Worsley, considered strategies for supplying plantation laborers for the English sugar colonies, particularly the new acquisition of Jamaica. So they had taken this from Spain. It says Worsley wrote that if the English Caribbean wanted to be sole masters of sugar for all the world, they could potentially use Guyana, the region of the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers, as a source for Indian slaves. Again, so these English were setting up shop, right? They had just acquired Jamaica. They're going to set up a sugar plantation, and they're already planning to get their slaves, not from Africa, right? But from the region on the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers. This is in Guyana. As a source for Indian slaves, not Africans. He argued that it would take less time and thus be more profitable. Less time, right? Than bringing people all the way from Africa, and thus be more profitable to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. More profitable, less time to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. Nevertheless, as this dissertation will highlight, each of these sources contained references to how Indian slaves contributed to the transformation of the Caribbean economy. So who had a strong influence in the transformation of the Caribbean economy? It was Indian slaves, and these sources contain many references of that. Just letting you know. Ad hoc purchases through captive markets and raids on indigenous communities during periods of war threatened Caribbean natives throughout the 17th century. All right, and it's titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, Ph.D. During the Indian Wars in Virginia, Governor Berkeley himself, in a letter, 1668, to Robert Smith, militia, commander in the Rappahannock country, not only proposed that, with the consent of the Council of War, a war of extinction be waged against the Northern Indians, but also suggested that the colonial government defray the expenses of the undertaking by the disposal of the women and children. Smith submitted Governor Berkeley's letter to the Rappahannock court for approval. In rendering their decision, the justices declared that the conduct of the Northern Indians, notably Duagos, and the neighboring Indians, justified the taking of severe measures against them, and accordingly advised, with the assistance of Almighty God, by the strength of our northern part, utterly to eradicate them, without further encroachment than the spoils of our enemies. All right, you hear all this, right? Then we're in the book Indian Slaves from Caribana, Trade and Labor in the 17th Century, Caribbean. And it says here, a number of accounts, deeds, and laws testify to the presence of Indian slaves on Barbados from its first settlement in 1627. Again, a number of accounts, deeds, and laws testify to the presence of Indian slaves on Barbados from its first settlement in 1627, right from the beginning. These were Indians. It was always Indians and always was Indians. Deeds used the language Negros, Indians, and other slaves. All right? So these deeds, they used the same language, right? As in the States, in the North, when they were classifying all your ancestors together and started making tags and these census records. And so these deeds and these islands as well, had language like Negroes, Indians, and other slaves to describe the laboring population attached to the properties sold. The Barbados Laws and Acts printed for Richard Hall in London in 1764 indicates that for all laws passed regarding Indians, one should see slaves. Again, in 1764, the Barbados Laws and Acts indicates that for all laws passed regarding Indians, one should see slaves. All right, so they made it synonymous. Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes, and it says here slaves from Terra Nova show up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. In Valencia during the period of 1516, we find in 1503 Miguel, age 20, and Mani, age 10. In 1505, Juan, who was 16, and Pedro, who was 16. In 1507, Antonio, who's 8, and Juan Amarco, 18. In 1515, Ali, now Melchor, 20. In 1516, Catalina. These 8 slaves were, with one exception, all obtained from Portuguese sources. They were all classified as Negros, with the exception of Juan and Pedro, called simply slaves. So most likely they were all the same kind of people. And again, Terra Nova, that's Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. All right.
In Seville, Spain, between 1510 and 1515, some 13 Terra Nova slaves were raised, stirred, and sold, and that's Newfoundland. 2 of these slaves were categorized as Negro, 1 of Loro, and 10 as slaves only. So you see, they keep telling us they were copper colored, right? Interestingly, between 1548 and 1560, some 20 slaves from Terra Nova appeared in Peru, out of 256 who can be identified geographically in the records. Between 1560 and 1650, about 143 slaves from Terra Nova showed up in Peru, coming by way of Iberia, probably. An additional 11 were classified as bozales. So you hear what they're saying, what they just said right there? They said from 1560 to 1650, about 143 slaves from Terra Nova. Says so these 143 slaves from Newfoundland, America, Newfoundland, Terra Nova showed up in Peru, coming by way of Iberia, probably. So you see what I'm trying to say is that they were bringing Native Americans, right? They'd bring all the way to Europe, all the way to Cape Verde, right, to the slave port, and then back into South America, in this case, into Peru. So these were American Indians they were bringing over, right, to Peru. It says here, for the Tabios people from Terra Nova, being often described as sooty or dark-colored, right, dark, Negro, might well be regarded sometimes as Negros rather than as Indios. This will be discussed in later chapters. So they're telling us that the Tabios are copper-colored Native Americans, and they were being taken
to Europe and over there listed as Negroes and sold. Americans were usually regarded as pardos, Portuguese, or loros, Spanish, in terms of color in the early period of 1492, early 1600s, but Negro was also used for them. The Terra Nova slave trade helps to explain the early depopulation of Newfoundland and the ease of the subsequent extinction of the American native inhabitants by the English. When Tigux was conquered and plundered, March 1541, Coronado imprisoned and made servants of all the people, 150 men, women, and children who were in it. The Tigux, when Tigux, the town or city, right, when it was conquered and plundered, all the native inhabitants, the American Indians that were there, all of them were made servants, 150 men, women, and children who were in it. Still, other Spanish expeditions were nothing more than slave raids or kidnapping excursions. You see this, right? So these so-called expeditions, right, most of them, probably all of them, were nothing more than slave raids or kidnapping excursions. They just changed the name. They put expeditions when they were really kidnapping excursions or slave raids. In 1520, Lucas Vasquez de Leon, listen to this, a wealthy resident of Hispaniola, determined to send out a ship for the purpose of exploring the section north of that covered by Ponce de Leon in 1513. His caravel met among the Bahamas a second ship sent out by another resident of Hispaniola to obtain Indian slaves. So their whole expedition was to obtain Indian slaves. Now, this Lucas Vasquez de Leon was one of the first Spaniards to actually reach up there in the states to try to settle a colony. They actually did kind of settle a town, Guadalupe, I believe it's called, in the Jordan River, but it wasn't successful. All right, and it tells you that he was actually the first one to bring so-called Negroes or Africans up. But when we read these accounts, these factual historical records, we know that this guy, the same guy is saying here, who's getting ready to go on an expedition to get Indian slaves, was actually enslaving Carib Indians and bringing him with him on these same slave race or kidnapping excursions, really, right? They weren't expeditions. So with these so-called Negroes he was bringing up, they were Caribs or Taínos from Hispaniola. The two vessels, right? So again, these two vessels that had joined in the Bahamas and proceeded toward the continent, which they reached June 25th, 1521, in the neighborhood of the River Jordan, the present Santi or Cambaji, and the cape afterward called Cabo de Santa Elena. By gifts and proffers of friendship, the Indians were lured on board, and the ships, having obtained a full cargo, set sail for Hispaniola. So you see these two ships, they lured Indians when they got to that area of the U.S. up there in the East Coast. They lured the Indians on their ships, and then they took off with them to Hispaniola and enslaved them. Two ships full of Indians. After the collapse of Narvaez's expedition, Cabeza de Vaca wandered through the southwest, hoping to reach Spanish settlements. Cabeza de Vaca relates that he continued his journey to Compostela in the company, among others, of 6 Christians and 500 Indian slaves. Again, he continued his journey to Compostela in the company of, among others, 6 Christians and what? 500 Indian slaves. 500 Indian slaves. All right, are you starting to add up the numbers?
A History of Slavery in Virginia by James Curtis Balla, Associate in History at Johns Hopkins University. All right, 1902. And it says here, for institutional beginnings of the system of American Negro slavery, we are to look then to the Bermudas and to Barbados, rather than to Virginia, Massachusetts, or New York. How far the rules regulating the relation of master and slave in the Spanish colonies influenced the custom and legislation of the English is difficult to determine. The contrast in the two resultant slave systems, if it be a safe guide, suggests that if any influence existed between them, it was extremely meager. Some connection, however, is shown between the system of the island and mainland colonies of England, particularly in the influence of Bermudas upon South Carolina. The introduction of the Negro as a profitable labor supply in the English as in the Spanish colonies was the result of a deliberate commercial design. A London mercantile company, the Company for the Somers Islands. All right, there we go. The Company for the Somers Islands sent in 1616 one of its trading ships to the West Indies for products. All right, so they had a ship. And this is, now pay attention, right? This is important. 1616, because these are supposed to be the first so-called African slave that was brought to the Americas or used in 1616, right? So it says that they had this company, the Somers Islands, which King James was involved in. All right, had basically some trading ships that they sent to the West Indies, right? Not Africa, right? They sent to the West Indies. We're gonna read somewhere else. Oh, we know already that it's in Venezuela. They sent. All right, they went to Venezuela, South America. All right, so again, in 1660, one of its trading ships to the West Indies for products, right, such as sugarcane, which they hoped to introduce into Bermudas, and for Negroes to divide for pearls. They went to go look for Negroes in Venezuela in 1616. Of America, the first Negro, together with a single Indian and West Indian products. The first Negro, you hear that? So-called Negro. They're just talking about American Indians. were to be brought back late in the summer of that year. So they went to South America, Venezuela, grabbed some Negroes to die for pearls, and they came back. They called one of them Negro and the other one Indian, and they went back to Bermuda. The relation of the Negro to the profitable cultivation of sugar cane was soon discovered, and fresh importations were made. All right, so we're gonna take a look at this article I found online. It's actually called "Before the Acadiba: The African Colonization of Bermuda, 1616, 1680s," by Dutch the Hijack. All right, it says, but it was, however, another captain, George Bargrave of the Edwin, who would make history when he left Bermuda in June 1616. He returned in August of that year. So he left Bermuda, right? He left Bermuda. He returned in August of that year with a variety of tropical items: sugarcane, figs, plantains, pineapples, and lignum vitae. But he also returned with one Indian and a Negro. Is this one Indian also a Negro? Huh? And who's this Negro? Where does it say he's African? Where in this record does it say he was from Africa? You understand what I'm trying to say and show you? That they've been telling us all our lives that the first so-called African that was put into plantation or slavery or whatever in America was in Bermuda in 1616. Is this account that I'm reading to you guys now? And this is as far as the trail goes. You're going to see there is no history of this so-called Negro other than this account. How does he lead, or how is he African? So why are they saying he's African the rest of the time? Unless you go to the original records where it just says a Negro and one Indian. All right, so he left from Bermuda, right? And ended up in South America and Venezuela. That's where he got these they call it the West Indies, but that's where he got these people. All right, and he went back and brought them to Bermuda in 1616. The latter of which a later governor, Nathaniel Butler, declared was the first these lands ever had. So the first they had. All right, so that's the reference. If Bargrave had carried out what Tucker's commission had commanded of Wilmot, as his other items seem to suggest he had, these two individuals were probably pearl divers, and thus, given the journey of about 2 months, probably originated from the nearest pearling stations in the Americas, the La Margarita, La Cumana operations off the coast of Venezuela. That's where they were coming from, near the Orinoco and Amazon, where we have numerous records, historic accounts of black tribes, so-called black, dark-skinned tribes in this area. All right. So this Negro most likely was American Indian. You got to prove to me this is an African. All right. So my whole point of this is to show you that you got to really research things and get to the bottom of it. All right. So again, they came from Venezuela, not from Africa. You can find this in Bermuda under the Summer Islands Company, Volume 1, 2005. Also, I wanted to mention that we will be discussing who was really being used for diving for pearls today. You know, which were American indigenous people who we're going to see, who had the expertise since ancient times. All right. They were the ones doing it since ancient times. Now, again, if you Google, Bermuda's first slaves or anything like that, you're going to get something like this. It says in the 17th century, right? 1616, first non-Anglos arrived. In 1616, the first so-called black man and a Carib Indian, all right? Carib Indian and a so-called black man were brought to Bermuda on the ship Edwin to dive for pearls. To dive for pearls. We're going to see today, we're going to read from a book of the history of the pearl, right? A very scholarly book. And we're going to see who was really diving and who was the experts, who were the so-called Spanish or British or so-called Dutch. Remember, these are Sephardic Jews, mostly Moorish, crypto Jews or crypto Muslims, who are the captains of these ships, who was all doing all this stuff, colonizing and again, these are indentured servants, a so-called black man and a Carib Indian to dive for pearls. We've actually going to see, there's no history of any so-called person that actually was born in Africa that ended up in Venezuela
that actually was brought to Bermuda? That's a whole lot of conjecture, and black is a crayon color. All right, so let's start the hijack.
So it says here, the Book of the Pearl, The History, Art, Science, and Industry of the Queen of Gems by George Frederick Kuntz, PhD, Charles Hugh Stevenson, LMM, whatever that means. So New York, this is written in 1908, all right? The Book of the Pearl. All right, so we're in chapter 10 of this book, and it says here, Pearl Fisheries of Venezuela. When I discovered the Indies, I said that they composed the richest country in the world, all right? When I discovered the Indies, the richest country in the world, I spake of gold and pearls and precious stones, and the traffic that might be carried on in them. Extract from Columbus, 4th letter. The Caribbean Sea furnishes one of the most interesting chapters in the history of the pearl fisheries. In no region of the world have these resources caused more rapid exploitation or affected the inhabitants to a greater extent than on the shores of Venezuela. All right, we're talking about the same place where they went and got the so-called Indian and Negro, right? In 1616. All right, so it affected the inhabitants. Who's the inhabitants? We're talking about the aboriginals, the indigenous people of that place. Before the discovery of America, the natives, again, the natives, not Africans, of this region collected pearls. All right, the natives of this region collected pearls from the mollusks, which they opened for food in times of necessity, and also sought them for ornamental purposes. And although they had large collections which they used for personal ornamentation and for decorating their temples, it does not appear that they prized them extravagantly, readily bartering from them for small returns. In Columbus' account of his third and fourth voyages to America, he repeatedly refers to pearls. On the third voyage in 1498, after passing the mouth of the Orinoco River, he entered the Gulf of Paria, where the natives came to the ship in their canoes in countless numbers, many of them wearing pieces of gold on their breasts, and some with bracelets of pearls on their arms. Seeing this, I was much delighted and made many inquiries with the view of learning where they found them. They replied that they were to be procured in their own neighborhood, and also at a spot to the northward of that place. Continuing the book, it says, this expedition of Pedro Alonso Niño was the first financially profitable voyage to America. And I think we got him in our Columbus and his Negro friends videos. He was actually a dark-skinned European. This is a so-called Negro European. This is Pedro Alonso Niño. All right, so it says that he was the first financially profitable voyage to America. After his return, the Cubagua pearl fishery in Venezuela became the object of numerous speculations, and many other Spaniards fitted out voyages, most of them sailing from Hispaniola or Haiti, 900 miles distant. Owing to the ill treatment of the Indians and excessive cruelties towards them, much difficulty was experienced in securing divers. This was relieved in 1508, listen to this, by transporting large numbers of Indians from Lucayan or Bahama Islands and impressing them into the service. So, how did they get their pearl divers? They got them from the Lucayan or the Bahama Islands, all right? So where does it say these were Africans? All right, so you see where if there was any so-called Negro or anybody being worked there as, divers, it was either the local American Indians that were there doing it for hundreds and thousands of years, or because of how they were treating them, they didn't want to be enslaved or do any more favors for the or trade, with the Spanish or Portuguese. They had to go get other Indians from the Lucayan and Bahama Islands, not Africans, other Indians. All right, so this so-called Negro and American Indian that they went and got from Venezuela that were expert pearl divers, all right, and they brought back to Bermuda, all right. How can we prove that's an African when there's more correlation to show that these are most likely with logic, all right? You can see that these are more likely American Indians, all right? Continuing, it says, these were so expert, we're talking about the Lucayan or Bahama Island people or Indians. These were so expert in the work, we're talking about pearl diving, that individuals sold for upward of 150 ducats each.
because they were so valuable at pearl diving. With their aid, the fishery prospered so greatly that in 1515 a settlement called New Cadiz was established on Cubagua Island by the governor of Hispaniola, Diego Columbus, son of the discoverer. You hear this? His son got into the pearl business. Alright, Columbus. This small island was dry and desolate, without water or wood, which were brought from the mainland, 20 miles distant from Margarita Island, about 3 miles to the northward. The cupidity of the proprietors of the fishery led to the most cruel treatment of the divers, and if the accounts of the time are to be relied upon, a large percentage of them died under the harsh regimen. About 1515, the unfortunate natives obtained an earnest and influential advocate in Bartolomé de las Casas, who in 1516 prevailed upon the youthful Charles V to decree that the fishery should be prosecuted only in summer, that the divers should not be required to work more than 4 hours a day where the depths exceeded 6 fathoms, that they should receive good nourishment and have a quart of wine daily, should have hammocks or beds in which to sleep, and should be provided with clothes to put on as soon as they left the water. And by later ordinances it was stipulated that death should be inflicted on anyone forcing a free Indian to dive for pearls. All right, it was Indians, not Africans. In 1528, the resources of Coche Island were exploited with so much success that within 6 months, 1,500 marks, 1,200 ounces of pearls were secured. Pearl banks were successfully found at Por la Mar, Maracapana, Curiano, and at various places on the coast, from the Gulf of Paria to the Gulf of Coro, a distance of over 500 miles, which became designated the Pearl Coast. All right. For a number of years previous to 1530, the output exceeded in value of 800,000 piastres annually, approximating one half of the produce of the American mines at that time. And who was working these mines? Who was diving for all this? This was American Indians. It was largely these pearls that enriched the cargoes of many of those famous caravels that crossed the Atlantic to Spain. Indeed, for several decades, America was best known in continental Europe as the land where the pearls came. So you think it was coincidence that they went from Bermuda to Venezuela to look for expert pearl divers? These were Indians that were working these places for hundreds of years already. It says, look, ruined and lost. It says here, Spanish destruction of the Pearl Coast in the early 16th century. All right, this is from Michael Perry, assistant professor of history in Texas A&M University. All right, it says in the early 16th century, the area that today comprises eastern Venezuela and its offshore islands enriched Spain with pearls, supplied Spanish colonists with Indian slaves, Indian, not Africans, and generated high hopes of finding interior civilizations rich in gold. Gold Coast, Pearl Coast. This over here, all of that. All right, so I just want to show you where Margarita Island is again. You know, we're going to get a little reference. We're going to try to do a little full circle here. So Isla Margarita, remember Margarita means pearl in Old Persian. Is this the original Margarita? Who named it, right? How did they know? You know, Margarita, and there's so much pearls there. You saw how much wealth. This is just one video. I read a lot of times how much pearls they got out of the Spanish and how much riches they made because of that. Now I want to show you, you know, from here, they say they were going to Bermuda, right? Bermuda is right here. You know, United States is over here, and Bermuda is right here in the middle of the ocean. This is Bermuda. So they were coming straight from over there, Margarita Island. Again, those were American Indians. They do admit one Carib Indian, right? And then they say a black man. But we already know it was American Indians in both ways. They have no proof of it being any African. That is all conjecture. Now, real quick, all right, remember the Bahamas, all right? Talked about the Lucayans being actually the ones who were being enslaved and sent to Margarita. Remember, it told us in that book, The History of the Pearl, that they were bringing Lucayans to dive. The Lucayans from the Bahamas. The Lucayans from the Bahamas. Talking about the aboriginal people of the Bahamas, right? The Lucayans. What did we learn? That they're dark-skinned race, a very dark-skinned race, very friendly, hospitable, good people that were taken advantage of, all right? They are dark of complexion, all right? This is what Columbus describing them. All of them go as naked as they came into the world. You know, that's his opinion.
You know, the hair is coarse. He's saying they are dark complexion. They are dark complexion. Again, dark skinned race, the Lucayans. So wouldn't these people be confused with so-called Africans, or be called so-called black, right? A black man, a black man. What is black? Black is a crayon color. Now, what else did we learn about the Lucayans? Again, it's called Pre-Columbus Black Nations of America, Primary Sources and Historical Images, and they're not from Africa. All right, but right here was something very important, and I'm going to do a whole big video about this eventually and just break it down, prove it, not just with the Lucayans, but with many different nations that were put under this and eventually classified in history as so-called blacks or so-called African slaves. But in reality, we know these are people of dark complexion, the Lucayans from Bahama, who were living in an Eden-like simplicity and happiness in their island. See? Now, what does this say? It says 20 years later, when Spaniards had exterminated nearly all the natives of Hispaniola, they stole away the Lucayans to the number of 40,000. 40,000 to slave in the mines and on the plantations of Hispaniola. So now, first of all, they were telling us that when they ran out of so-called local labor or indigenous slaves, they were going to Africa to get more to replenish them, right? But look what they really came. They came for the Lucayans, and then, you know, not just the Lucayans, but these are one of the people they came for. Look at this, 40,000. All right, so a lot of these, it says after 50 years they became extinct. No, you're not extinct, you're still here. A lot of them didn't just end up in Hispaniola. We know now a lot of them based on the book we just read. Let's just go back to it real quick, right? Again, the book of the Pearl we just read, right? What did it tell us? Who was they bringing to Margarita? Margarita means pearl in Old Persian. That is America is the true old world. You see the full circle. Now let me show you another full circle again. All right, so again, remember what it told us. And remember where the Lucayans were taken, supposedly, right? 40,000 of them were taken to Hispaniola. Now, where were these so-called Spanish coming from to supplying the divers? Now, look, pay attention. After his return, the Cubagua pearl fishery became the object of numerous speculations, and many other Spaniards fitted out voyages from, most of them sailing from Hispaniola or Haiti, all right, 900 miles distant. Owing to the ill treatment of the Indians and excessive cruelties towards them, much difficulty was experienced in securing divers. So they were having trouble getting the local population, indigenous population, to keep diving for them. So what did they do? This was relieved in 1508 by transporting a large number of Indians from the Lucayan or Bahama Islands, large numbers of them. Remember, they had almost 40,000 of them they enslaved, and look who was really coming. And they were coming from Hispaniola, a lot of them, because remember, they were trying to send them to Hispaniola when they didn't need more over there. Where else would they were sending them? To Margarita here in Cubagua Island, Margarita here to dive for pearls, right? Margarita and Venezuela. And this is where they supposedly got the same so-called black man and a Carib Indian to go to Bermuda eventually. It's a full circle. You guys see the hijack. I hope you guys understand. This is big. With their aid, the fishery prospered so greatly that in 1515, a settlement called New Cadiz was established on Cubagua Island by the governor of Hispaniola, Diego Columbus, son of the discoverer, right? New Cadiz. Cadiz is a Moorish town, isn't it? So again, let me show you the journey. So the Lucayans, right? The Lucayans came from here, Bahamas, right? They were sent all the way down here to Venezuela's Margarita Island. All right. From there, some of them eventually ended up in the Bermudas Islands. You see, full circle, and it was never anything to do with so-called Africans or any other people being enslaved. This was local population a lot of the times. Again, I've done many videos about American Indian slavery. Make sure to go back on that whole series from Indigenous American to African American so you guys can get the information again. We've proven who the Spanish, who the Portuguese, the Dutch, so-called English, all these so-called tags, you know, who they were really using for their labor, for their indentures, for their encomiendas and so-called slavery. And the other source, again, was coming not from Africa, but from Europe. From Europe, their indentured servants, their unwanted, all the Sephardic Jews and Moors they were getting rid of, Huguenots, Protestants, undesirable, the Black Irish, all this stuff, the Jacobite prisoners, everything we've learned. All right, we got to start really getting over our beliefs and just start going with the truth and the history. It says here, World Columbian Exposition at Chicago. The Venezuela Ministerio de Relaciones, or the Ministry of Relations, of Exterior Relations, from Venezuela. Again, World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the United States of Venezuela in 1893. This is the name of the book. We're going to go to page 96. And it says here, I guess chapter 3, Slave Hunters in Maracapana. Now remember, I did a video about the origin of the name America. We had that word here already. When the Spanish got here, there was actually a place called Amaraca or Amaruca, that the indigenous population had towns and cities named like that, Amaraca, in South America on the coast there. All right, so this is part of it, Macarapana, infamous traffic, the infamous traffic of the so-called Indians, development of New Cadiz. Remember, New Cadiz was the colony of Columbus' son, right? So we're going to get into this part of the book. This is actually a coat of arms they found in the water. There was a big earthquake there in 1543 that destroyed New Cadiz. It was actually erased from history, New Cadiz. And this is actually Charles V's coat of arms. This is famous. They found it there in the water and off the coast after the earthquake, after hundreds of years, they found it. All right, and it was Charles V. Now we're going to read again what Charles V was doing to the indigenous population here. Now it says down here, the royal audience wished by this means to acquire correct information concerning the war with the natives. In case hostilities were decided, the commissioners were to sign a report to the effect which was to be forwarded to the sovereign, who would then give orders to pursue the Indians as rebels. All right, they're declaring war on the indigenous population. It would have been impossible to enact a measure more favorable to the slave dealers, for the result would infallibly be war. No regular war declaration, however, was required to hunt down the Indians. The produce of the oyster fisheries had fallen off so much in 1534 that the dealers had to seek some other branch of trade in order to obtain the same profit as formerly. All right, so because remember, they had the indigenous population getting the pearls, they were running out. And so what they turned to, they started turning into slavery, right? They were using that as the trade. So they were needing, free laborers or so-called slaves, and that was the indigenous population they were going to use. And because of how they enslaved so many populations, destroyed so many lives there, it says here, this revenge of populations suffering from pillage, devastation, and the reduction to slavery of parents and children was but just and logical, yet it induced the government to take measures which only increased the evil. In consequence of an act of piracy committed by Carib Indians on the coast of Margarita in 1535, the king again decreed that the Caribs, again, who was the Caribs? I just showed you guys the pictures, right? The images. Who was the Caribs? Should be reduced to bondage. Remember, return to Egypt, or bondage. Egypt, bondage, return to bondage. They were to be considered as slaves, just as such, and marked if a marking iron was available. An annual report of the number of slaves marked was to be forwarded to the home government. All right, they're talking about iron, putting iron on people, right? Branding them, right? Marked with an iron if it was available, and sending the numbers to the home government, who was again Charles V, right? Holy Roman Emperor. Carlos V, aka Charles V. All right. Let's go back. It says here, the zone of the pearl fisheries was extended, and fresh Spanish and Italian adventurers were to prey on the wealth extracted from the mollusk, which during centuries had quietly rested beneath the waters. Cubagua was on the wane. Its pearl deposits were disappearing because the Indians, urged by the insatiable cupidity of the conquistadors, had ended by extirpating them, but there were still natives remaining on their athletic shoulders, on the tender arms of their children. The burning iron inscribed the deed of property according to the sentence passed by legal cupidity. Right? They were being branded. This was the state of things in Cubagua when Benzoni visited the island in 1542. We're going to get Benzoni's account right now in a different book, right? Because it's more detailed than this little paragraph right here. So we're going to get his account soon but this is what he encountered. They're saying when he arrived there in 1542, the indigenous population being treated very cruelty and put under slavery. Indians, not so-called Africans, all right? Before we go on to Benzoni, I just want to read to you what Bartolomé de las Casas had to say about the fisheries and these pearl divers, right? What they were doing to them. Now listen to this. This is very crazy. Let me see if I can zoom in. And it says, this horrible description does not stand alone. Here's the heart-rending narrative of Bartolomé de las Casas. Hardly had the Indian pearl fisheries issued from the water with a supply of oysters when their masters forced them to dive again without allowing them to recruit their strength and draw breath. They were like, no, go back down. They were making them go back down when they hadn't even catch their breath. If through sheer necessity the Indian remained above water a few minutes, the master whipped, all right, obliged him to dive again. Nearly all the slaves thus employed died in a short time. They were fed on the remains of oysters. Occasionally, they got some cassava bread, but they never received any wine or strengthening liquor to restore their weakened bodies, which had become covered with scales through the continual contact of salt water. So these people got scales in their skin now. At night, these poor creatures were confined in stocks and loaded with chains so as to procure any possibility of escaping. At dawn, their dreary round of work again began. Many disappeared, devoured by sharks. Others would faint away or vomit blood. Most of them died of hunger, cruel treatment, and despair. All right, that's from Bartolomé de las Casas' primary source. This is a picture unequaled by any of Dante's Inferno. Human beings like unto spectres, covered with scales, with shoulders furrowed by the whip, ulcerated, dying of hunger, alternately plunging into the rising from the waters, bearing to their implacable tormentors the prices they had wrested from the bosom of the seas. And again, who are we talking about? Again, these are some Caribs, right? These are some other Caribs right here. All right, more Caribs. Who are we talking about when they're talking about, doing this to people? So-called Indians. All right, Carib woman right here. All right, Caribs from St. Vincent down here. More Caribs from Dominica. Who's the Caribs, right? And again, who else were they using? Who did they send to dive? Right? Lucayans, right? Lucayans, dark-skinned people, Lucayans. They were the ones. So Caribs and Lucayans and Arawaks, any people that were there, and any other populations that were being used, even from Panama, even from North America, as so-called slaves, even from Peru, even from other parts like Brazil, they were bringing them there, and that's who they were using. And these are the people that they were just describing with scales and all that bad treatment. This infamous and never-ending traffic, this continual assassination of defenseless populations, which were to disappear like the inhabitants of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, this holocaust of victims of the lash, slavery, hunger, and want of sleep did not satisfy the greed of the conquistadors. Again, who's these conquistadors? The oyster beds and the inhabitants of the Venezuelan shores and islands had ceased to exist. The last of the natives had witnessed his sisters dishonored and his family ruthlessly sacrificed. And that's what I wanted to read to you, this account from Bartolomé de las Casas regarding and correlating what we read about, right? Learned about just yesterday about the pearls, right? And how they were using the American Indians, right? Eventually in history, they became so-called just slaves or blacks, right? Or so-called Africans, right? But they were indigenous populations, all right? So now we're going to go to another book. Again, we're going to get Benzoni's version of what he saw when he got there. We just got De las Casas, primary source, but now we're going to get another primary source, Benzoni.
With the book, which is called Spanish and Portuguese South America During the Colonial Period by Robert Grant Watson. It says editor of Murray's Handbook of Greece, 4th edition, and also author of a book called The History of Persia. So he's very popular and with these historical books, right? A scholarly source. The Italian traveler Benzoni, who had been referred to in the preceding pages, has been quoted by Robertson, Irvin, and Helps, but considering the unique position which he holds as being the first foreign critic of the proceedings of the Spaniards in South America, I scarcely think that his volume has received the full attention which it deserves at the hands of modern writers on Spanish South America. I would therefore draw attention to some extracts from his work, begging the reader to bear in mind that they proceed by no means from a man of the mold of Las Casas, but from one who, by his own confession, took part in a slave hunting expedition. All right, so they're saying, all right, we're going to read this account from this person. He ain't no angel like Las Casas. That's what they're saying. He actually was a slaver. All right, it says the author in question was nevertheless, as he states, a devout Christian. So even though he was enslaving American Indians, because that's what we're talking about here, not Africans, the author in question, it says, was nevertheless a devout Christian. And he dedicates his history of the New World to Pope Pius the Fourth. All right, so it says Benzoni, all right, remember the slaver, started for America in the year 1541, and there spent 14 years of toil and travail, landing at the Gulf of Paria. All right, this is in South America, I believe, close to Venezuela, or in Venezuela today. He proceeded to Cuba and other islands, returning thence to Acla. When he crossed to Panama, from which place he visited the kingdom of Peru. The kingdom of Peru. In this wandering course, he passed 14 years. Benzoni is the author who is originally responsible for the well-known story of Columbus and the egg. He states that whilst at Amaracapana, all right, let me take that off so you can see that. Amaracapana. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit. It's a little better, right? I want you guys to see this. So, Amaracapana, Captain Callis arrived with upwards of 4,000 slaves, 4,000 slaves, and had captured many more. When some of them could not walk, the Spaniards, to prevent their remaining behind to make war, killed them by burying their swords in their sides of their breast. So when they couldn't survive these slaves they had, they would just kill them so they wouldn't, make delays or stay behind or anything like that. All right. It was really a most distressing thing to see the way in which these wretched creatures, naked, tired, and lame, were treated, exhausted with hunger, sick and despairing. The unfortunate mothers, with 2 and 3 children on their shoulders or clinging round their necks, overwhelmed with tears and grief, all tied with cords or with iron chains around their necks, or their arms or their hands. Nor was there a girl but had been violated by the depredators. Oh man, they were even violating girls. At page 159, Benzoni observes that Spaniards have eulogized themselves too much when they tell us that they are worthy of great praise for having converted to Christianity the tribes and nations that they subjugated. All right, so we're talking about these tribes and nations. All right, for there is great difference between the name and the being one in reality. All right, so even though they were bolstering themselves, talking about we were evangelizing them and making them civilized and Christian, all right, they were covering that, the cruelties, atrocities that they were committing. All right, with that, it says the slaves, all right, this is quotes, somebody saying this, all right, it says the slaves are all marked in the face and on the arms by a hot iron with the mark of C. Then the governors and captains do as they like with them. Some are given to the soldiers, so that the Spaniards afterwards sell them or gamble them away amongst each other. When ships arrive from Spain, they barter these Indians for wine. Who? The Indians. All right. So let's go back. All right. I want you to understand what's going on here. All right. Because it says that Benzoni, right? Remember, he arrived at where? At Amaracapana. There was already a place called Amaracapana in South America. All right. He arrived with what? With 4,000 slaves, it says, right? Now we go back. Who were these slaves? These were Indians, right? So when ships would arrive there, what they would do from Spain, they would barter these Indians for wine, flour, biscuit, and other requisite things. And even when some of the Indian women are pregnant by the same Spaniards, they sell them without any conscience. Then the merchants carry them elsewhere. They take them to the other side, reverse, and sell them again, others are sent to the island of Hispaniola. All right, so once they leave their mainland, their indigenous land, and they travel to these other places, right? These servants and slaves that they capture, these indigenous people, they put in captivity, prisoners of war. They would call them Negros from there. You understand? Filling with them some large vessels built like caravels. All right, filling the vessels, right? Filling with what? With Indians, not Africans, Indians, and supplying what? Hispaniola. Because why? They had already decimated most of the population of Hispaniola through the same kind of slavery, sending them elsewhere with their diseases. A lot of suicides, a lot of cruelties was going on, so the population would decrease fast. They were, you know, not mean. We're not saying you went extinct, of course not, but they had to replenish the slave population. All right, and they did it with other indigenous people. All right, so it says they carried them under the deck, and being nearly all people captured inland, they suffered severely the sea horrors. And not being allowed to move out of those sinks, what with their sickness and their other ones, they have to stand in the filth like animals. And the sea often being calm, water and other provisions failed them, so that the poor wretches, oppressed by the heat, the stench, the thirst, and the crowding, miserably expired there below. All right, we're talking about American Indians that are experiencing this cruelty. All right, we're talking about Deuteronomy 28. And, you know, this is untold truth of ancient America. All right. And, you know, but you see how this correlates with what we've learning in the other series, right? Who was getting enslaved by the Spanish? The Indians, right? It's another account right here, letting you know straight up. Look what they went through in these ships. All right. Now, all that country around the Gulf of Paria and other places are no longer inhabited by Spaniards. Finally, out of the 2 million of original inhabitants of Hispaniola, through the number of suicides and other deaths occasioned by the oppressive labor and cruelties imposed by the Spaniards, there are not 150 now to be found, and this has been their way of making Christians out of them. What befell these poor islanders has happened also to all the others around. Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and other places. And although an almost infinite number of the inhabitants of the mainland have been brought to these islands as slaves, they have nearly all since died. And it says the initial letter of the Emperor Charles V. All right. So who was saying this? Who was describing this? Charles V. And what were they putting on their face and in their arms? With a hard iron, a mark of C for Charles V. C for Charles V. All right. Charles V. Do you understand what he looked like? He was another brother, colored, so-called Negro. This is just another more on more war. All right. And, get into this book right away. It's called the Virginia Cavalcade. This is volume 33. This is from spring of 1984. Right, issue 4, volume 33, issue 4 again, if you guys want to look for it, the Virginia Cavalcade. All right, so I go to page 168 on this book, and on this chapter is called Sold into Slavery, in Retribution Against the Non-Asiatical Indians by Gwenda Morgan. Though the Indians pleaded not guilty, the jury decided against them. On 5th of October, the court sentenced 5 of the accused, Old Master Thomas, Bearded Jack, Jack the Fiddler. You hear that? Jack the Fiddler. This is the real Jack the Fiddler. Tom Anthony and George to be hanged. They hanged. Who were they hanging, huh? Who were they hanging? The 1920s. Who were they hanging? Nothing's changed, right? The sentence was carried out at once, right away. So as soon as they got charged, they went right outside. They hung them. 2 others, Long Tom and Young Toby, both of whom pleaded guilty, were also sentenced to die, although the court urged their reprieve because they had given evidence against their fellow tribesmen. They had snitched, huh? Did they beat them and force them to plead guilty and also snitch? For some reason, this is starting to sound like the Tituba Salem witch trials to me.
somebody being forced, right? One Indian, Frank, was acquitted. What was now to be done with the 40 or so remaining members of the tribe still in custody and under heavy guard? Why are these people so threatened by the rest of the tribe? Why are they so threatened by these people? Remember, these are warriors. These are not treaty signing Indians. The militia officers proposed a drastic solution. They resurrected an old Virginia law that, when a settler was murdered, made the Indians of the nearest town answerable for the crime with their lives or liberties. You hear that? They recommended that the surviving Indians be tried according to this act, first introduced in 1663, and if found guilty, transported out of the colony. All right, I want to remind everybody that's exactly what we went over in those videos that I was showing you guys earlier in my series From Indigenous American to African American. We read some very good scholarly, educational, primary sources telling us this. We're reading all the things that were going on at that time. You know, a lot of this stuff, again, is just excuses to move these Indians out of the way, really, especially the ones that are not complying or signing treaties. So what happened? What were they thinking of doing? Transporting the whole tribe out of the colony. This course of action, they assured the council, would promote the future peace, quiet, and security of Virginia and meet the particular satisfaction of the inhabitants of these parts. So they're like, yeah, we'll finally be able to take over their land and nobody's going to resist or fight us. And we already got the other Indians on our side and making treaties with us. The council agreed, and the hapless Indians were passed from one set of county authorities to the next until they reached the colonial capital. There, lodged in a public jail, they endured the winter in captivity. So I want to again show you what happened to the Nansaticos, who were not letting these settlers take their land, who were trying to fight to survive and feed their families and keep their prehistoric land. So continuing in the book, the assembly considered the Nansiaticos case in May 1705. The council and the House of Burgesses differing over what degree of guilt could be laid to the Indians' charge. The Burgesses took the view that the Indians were most likely guilty of complicity in the murders and should be removed from the colony. Most likely, right, guys? Most likely they were probably guilty in the murder too, and they're probably gonna do it, or we should just remove them from the colony. I wonder what the Akamaki said about that. All those above the age of 12 whom they regarded as most dangerous should be transported to England or the West Indies, sold as servants for 7 years, and barred on pain of death from ever returning to Virginia. Do you guys hear that? They got sold into slavery. And of course, they even telling you the drop. It was actually indentured servitude. 7 years. What happened after 7 years? They were free, but they couldn't return to Virginia. They got barred. If they got caught coming back, they would be killed. Those children who were under 12 should be bound out amongst the English. All right, they were bound out, meaning the children were made servants or bounded, right, indentured, and they were bound out to these people, these so-called English, amongst, right, so-called English. A lot of these so-called English are actually crypto Jews, crypto Muslims. Yes, we've gone over the information. Let's not forget the previous drop. Let's talk truth and facts here. No matter feelings and emotions, guys. We got to take the good and the bad to understand true history. It's in the past. So these children were bound out to the settlers, while their older family members, parents, and guardians were sent out of the colony into slavery. And they had to serve them until the age of 24 and never return to the Rappahannock River to live in another Indian town, all right? So they had to do an indenture till they were 24, 25. That's a lot of years, and that was common with children under indenture servitude. We've read this in the videos I showed you guys, so make sure to get those videos so you guys can see the full history of Indian slavery, the true slavery, so-called slavery, right? True slavery here. So these children were bound out all those years, right? All those years. So of course they're gonna say, oh yeah, he was a slave and then he was freed by his master. So you see, a lot of the time it's not that they were freed; it's just that their indenture was over. Of course they were freed. That was already set when they got bounded out. They were to be freed when they were 24 and 25, not because their master wanted to, free them just because. And these were African slaves. You guys understand? You got to put all of this into perspective, so you got to understand what really was going down. So they weren't even able to return to their ancient homeland. It's psychological. They want to make sure they killed the Indian. Remember, got to kill the Indian out of you. Take the Indian out of you. In its treatment of the Indians, the House of Burgesses proved harsher than the council. Members of the council tried to save some of the elderly from transportation. They proposed to exclude an old Indian man, Maddox Will. That's his name, Maddox Will, and his wife, Betty, right? And attempted to set both free. They also proposed that most of the women and girls be sold not in the West Indies, but on the eastern shore of Virginia. The House of Burgesses, however, was adamant. All the adults must go, and the council ultimately agreed to the demand. Arrangements were made with Sea Captain John Martin. All right, Martin. Again, we've gone over who these peoples are based on their name and their history, their ethnicity, for the expulsion of the Indians from Virginia. Subsequently, the members of the council divided up the 13 young children of the Nanciaticos among themselves by casting lots for them. You hear that? Casting lots for them, just like in scripture. Governor Francis Nicholson took 4 children, and the other members of the council 1 each. 4 of these children were between 9 and 18 months old. Wow. These were babies. In May of 1706, 21 months after the murders, the council received a letter from John Gemans, Lieutenant Governor of Antigua in the Leeward Islands, confirming the arrival and sale of the Nanciatico Indians. All right? This was where they were sent, to Antigua, to the Caribbean, And guess what they told us, guys, in history? That they were bringing so-called Negroes from Africa into Antigua, right? So they were being sent to Antigua, right, to the Caribbean, the small West Indian island of sugar and slaves was to be their place of permanent exile to a sugar plantation. American Indians, Nanciatico Indians, because they didn't want to make treaties and let these settlers just take their land and do whatever they wanted, they got exiled. They got sent as slaves to the sugar plantations. This is real history, not false African narratives. What became of them there is unknown. All right, what happened to them there? Let me guess, they became Negroes, right? You guys know that, right? That's what they tell us in history. What Nanciatico Indians? They never told us about this in school. They told us they were sending Africans to Antigua. You know what I'm talking about, professors. Some probably did not survive long. Others may have left descendants. Oh, others may have left descendants. Oh, you don't think so? Oh, you don't think a lot of the people in Antigua are Nanciatico Indians? Well, they are.
Just want to continue to show you who the Spanish and Portuguese, will also include the Dutch in this video, who were they really enslaving? They weren't Africans, they were American Indians. So, Central America, right? Ancient Central America. So now I want to read from, it's like the first page of this article. I was only able to find the first page, but it's very good. So I just want to show you. It's from Slavery and Abolition, a Journal of Slave and Post-Slave Studies. This is from volume 15, issue number 2, 1994. And the name of the article is called Colonization and Slavery in Central America. All right, and this is written by Nigel Boland. So it says here, in the development of the Atlantic world after 1492, Central America was always a peripheral, as it remains today. Yet it is precisely the peripheral nature of its relationship to this emerging world that is the key to understanding the particular patterns of colonization and varieties of slavery that existed in the 3 centuries following the conquest. The relationship between colonization and slavery in Central America from the early 16th century to the mid 19th century was affected by the fact that the region remained throughout this period at the periphery of the Spanish and British empires. The demand for labor in the early Spanish settlements of Hispaniola, Cuba, Panama, and Peru resulted in a large-scale Indian slave trade in Central America in the second quarter of the 16th century. Again, because of the demand of labor, what was happening in Hispaniola? Again, let's get grounded. Because of what they were doing, enslaving and killing by the seas and putting the Indians to work so much, they were dying by the millions, millions. They were dying by the millions in Hispaniola. All right, almost 7 million died in Hispaniola. So what did they have to do? They tell us in textbooks that they had to bring in Africans to replace the Indians that basically perished, almost became extinct in Hispaniola. But as it says here, because of the demand for labor in the early Spanish settlements of Hispaniola, right, in Cuba, not just there, in Panama as well, and Peru, resulted in large-scale Indian slave trade in Central America in the second quarter of the 16th century. So they were grabbing all these indigenous people from Central America to fill the demand for slave labor in those islands and those parts of their colonies like Panama and Peru. Indeed, the first colonial economy of the region was based on slave trading. Again, and the first colonial economy of the region was based on slave trading, supported by the colonial officials themselves. This odious commerce, more accurately conceived as looting than as trade, remained the principal colonial economic activity until the decline in population reduced the supply. The export of as many as 500,000 enslaved Indians prior to 1550 contributed to the rapid and severe depopulation of Central America in the 16th century. Again, the export, listen to this, my people, please. The export of as many as 500,000 enslaved Indians prior to 1550. When did the so-called transatlantic slave trade start? When did it supposedly begin? There was already 500,000 people taken from Central America, exported. Where? How? In ships, right? Or did they teleport? Or did they have planes? In ships. Deuteronomy 28. They were taken in ships to the other colonies and over to Europe. All right? Prior, way before the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Way before. All right? This helped severely depopulate Central America in the 16th century. All right, Indian slavery, and where they get sent to the West Indies, West Africa, Europe. Subsequent.
The second source of slaves after 1500 was the Caribbean region, which very soon included the adjacent coast of South America, Florida, Carolina, and Mesoamerica. Many Americans were taken as slaves to the east, to Spain, to the Canary Islands, often as a result of direct authorization of the crown, thumb diversos, right? In 1499, for example, Vicente Llanes Pinzon was authorized to discover islands and mainland in the Indies, and permission was given to take all manner of slaves, Negros, Loros, or others, who in Spain are held as slaves. Moreover, the authorization given by Ferdinand and Isabella to Rodrigo de Bastidas, June 1500, allowed for the importation of slaves to Spain who were Negros and Loros, who in the kingdoms of Castilla were held and reputed for slaves, of whom the crown was to receive a quarter share. A similar clause was inserted in another authorization of the same year. Speaking of the late 1499-1503 expeditions to northern South America, Jose Antonio Sacco states that one of the objects of these expeditions was that of robbing human beings in order to sell them as slaves. Alright, another account of them taking Native Americans so they can sell as slaves. The expeditions were to be obtained slaves from among the Negros and or Loros who lived in the discovered lands. Alright, you hearing this? As we shall see in later chapter, Loro was regularly applied as a color term for Americans, while Negro was also used. But in this case, the usage meant simply that any brown or black people found could be enslaved if people of similar status were already held as slaves in Spain. A series of voyages then ensued, including that of Alonso de Ojeda, who in 1500 disembarked more than 200 American slaves at Cadiz. Americo Vespucci also reports having sold more than 200 Americans in Spain. Even Americo Vespucci, right? He came over here and grabbed. They were all, anybody who came over here, all those explorers, right? Didn't just come explore. They always took back something with them, and mainly human flesh. That's what they were taking back. By the thousands, right? It's starting to add up. I hope it's starting to add up for you. In 1500, Janez Pinzon captured 36 Americans in northern Brazil, as well as some other places. They were landed at Palos, Spain, where a legal dispute ensued.
In 1499,
Diego de Lepe also departed from Palos and proceeded to enslave Americans in the Amazon region and the Gulf of Paria. The slaves were turned over to Bishop Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca in Spain. In 1501, Cristobal Guerra and his brothers Luis brought a large number of slaves from Paria, La Isla Margarita, and other areas to Spain. On the other hand, in 1503, Juan de Costa sailed to the Cartagena region, seized 600 Americans. Cartagena, that's I believe there in Colombia. 600 Americans, right? Native Americans, and majority of whom were sent to Spain with Luis Guerra, brother or other relation to Cristobal Guerra. Costa went on to seize other Americans in the Gulf of Uraba, so he was bringing a lot of them. So he brought 600 that time. Who knows how many more? Again, by the thousands, we have records here.
at one time Soto possessed 800 Indians given him by an Indian chief to act as porters. 800. The leaders must have some means of rewarding the services of their soldiers. Gold and other desirable objects were scarce. Indian slaves helped satisfy this need. Soto apportioned women slaves among his men. The narrators relate the capture and distribution of such women in groups of 100 to 300. Groups of women, aboriginal women, being enslaved, right? To serve as cooks and mistresses for their pleasure. Groups of 100 to 300. Groups of 100 to 300 of women. Indian American Indian women, indigenous women, your ancestors.
After 1510, Spanish slave raiding reached out increasingly towards the outer islands of the Caribbean and the adjacent mainlands. Much of their raiding was designed to meet the labor needs of Haiti, where the native population was being greatly reduced. But numerous Spanish expeditions, such as those of Magellan, 1519, Sebastian Cabot, 1529, to Brazil, and Gomez, 1525, captured Americans who were taken to Spain or who died en route. Cabot also purchased 50 to 60 slaves from the Portuguese in Brazil for later sale in Seville. By the 1520s, slave raiding in Florida and the Carolina coast area was common also. You hear this? Where were they grabbing them again? From Florida and Carolina? So they tell us that the first slaves were being brought to America from Africa in 1619, but they was already taken Native Americans, right, so-called Negros, from Florida and the Carolina in the 1520s. It was very common, it says here. Especially in the years around 1500, some Americans were actually freed and returned to the Caribbean from Spain, it says here. But the numbers seem few in comparison with those actually shipped over there. In 1541, the bishops of Santa Marta, now Colombia, wrote to the Emperor Charles V that in that region, thus Spaniards were exporting American slaves from Peru to Colombia, and many were being sent to Spain with the help of officials and in spite of laws to the country. So they were going. So now so far we got a picture what's going on, right? So they just grabbing Indians from anywhere. They had little ports everywhere set up in in their major cities in the Americas where they had their their governments, their colonial governors. And so there was Indians from Peru being taken to Colombia before they were being sent to Spain, right?
By the law of
On December 18, 1547, a royal official wrote from Santo Domingo.
So it says here in Spanish that His Majesty mandated to take Indians, especially women, so they can sell them publicly in Seville, and that's in Spain, and from a lot from the terra firme, which was South America.
So thus in 1547, American slaves, especially females, were still being sold in Seville, and the acceptance of such sales in the latter city gave birth to the impudence of Spaniards in the Indies, who continued to ship American slaves in defiance of the laws. During this period, the northern coast of South America seems to have served as a major source of slaves, with slave ships arriving at Haiti from Paria and Cumana as late as 1544. It says here in Italian, Girolamo Benzoni was in the Indies from 1541 to 1556. He later wrote that all the slaves that the Spaniards catch in these provinces are sent to Cubagua, Cuba, right? The slaves are all marked in the face and on the arms by a hot iron with the mark of C for Caribe with a question mark. When ships arrived from Spain, they bartered these Indians for wine, flour, biscuit, and other requisite things. And even when some of the Indian women are pregnant by these same Spaniards, they sell them without any conscience. Then the merchants carry them elsewhere and sell them again. Others are sent to the island of Hispaniola or Haiti, filling with them some large vessels built like caravels.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. As we shall see, some Americans were still being shipped to Europe by Spaniards in this period, even though labor shortages, more than royal decrees, operated to favor their being retained in the Americas. Alright, so even though they were shipping them over to Europe, they were still using a lot of them for the plantations, the local plantations in the Americas. It was primarily Cuba, Haiti, and Borinquen, or Puerto Rico, right? Which absorbed Mayas from Yucatan. Alright, so all these islands were getting what? Mayas, not Africans. Mayas from the Yucatan. Huastecas from Mexico. Mosquitos from Nicaragua, and various other nations during this era, rather than Spain itself, or let me add, Africa. Alright, so other American Indians being brought to these places. Okay? Note, should also be made of the many Americans sent to Spain in capacities other than that of slave. So, not just as slaves that were being taken to Europe, right? And these are the ones that are rarely accounted for. Many were sent to become interpreters. Remember, they would send in a lot of them so they can train them in their languages, so they can bring them back to help them invade, right? And speak and be interpreters. Or to be instructed and baptized. Others went as curiosities or as entertainers. In 1528, for example, Hernan Cortes took a group of Aztec and Tlaxcalteco chiefs, including a son of Moctezuma II, to Spain, along with a troop of jugglers, acrobats, and dancers. All right, these are American Indians. These also were taken to the court of Pope Clement VII in Rome. A different kind of figure was Juan Santos Atahualpa of Peru, taken to Spain and Angola by the Jesuits. Where? Angola. In reverse, Angola. All right, Inca from Peru.
Titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, Ph.D. During Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the Assembly, at his instigation, declared the enslavement of Indians for life to be legal. Again, during Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the Assembly, at his instigation, declared the enslavement of Indians for life to be legal and made provisions for granting captive Indians to soldiers as a partial inducement to volunteer.
This act was repealed by the General Act setting aside all the acts of this assembly that sat in 1676 under the rule of Bacon. But it was again revived by the Assembly of 1679, called by Deputy Governor Ciccelli. Legal enslavement of Indians was prohibited by implication rather than by the terms of the Act of 1691. But the North Carolina Indian troubles in November 1711 once more brought the old law forward, and captives Indians belonging to tribes at war with the English were directed to be transported and sold, those capturing them to have the money of the sale. It will be noted that, though in the case of Virginia, as in that of the other colonies, the disposal of the Indians captured in war was sanctioned by the colonial government, the action of the Virginia government in the matter ended with that sanction. By the Acts of 1643 and 1658, the colony lost the right to possess servants. Therefore, the government during the Indian Wars decreed that the captive Indians were the property of their captors, who were entitled to the proceeds of their sale. In the case of Maryland, is found another colony in which the government intended that the Indian captives taken in war should be sold for the benefit of the colony. At the time of the Puritan ascendancy, the Indians began to be troublesome. The Nanticoke of the eastern shore began a war upon the settlers. March 29, 1652, on petition of the settlers, the General Assembly attempted to pass a militia act. An expedition was planned and a levy of troops made. The captive Indians were to be sold, but the government never had a chance to carry out any such sale, for the Puritans of Anne Arundel County refused to make their levies, and the expedition had to be abandoned. During the Tuscarora War in North Carolina, one again finds an instance of a colonial government taking possession of the captive Indians, selling them as slaves, and depositing the proceeds of the sales in the colonial treasury. At the breaking out of the war, Governor Hyde instructed the agents whom he sent to South Carolina to ask for military aid to represent to the colonial authorities there the great advantage that may be made of slaves, there being many hundreds of them, women and children. May we not believe 3 or 4,000, again, 3 or 4,000, they're plotting, talking about you, your ancestors, so-called Negroes, they were going to send to their colonies all over the world and in the United States and West Indies. All right, there's at least 3 to 4,000. All right, they were plotting. The colony indeed found the disposal of the captives to be as profitable as had been hoped. The promised reward of slaves as pay for services rendered brought the desired Indian allies. On one occasion, Tom Blunt, chief of the tribe of friendly Indians in the area of disturbance, in making arrangements with the colonial government for an attack on a certain tribe, specified that his warriors receive payment in captives in failing these and other commodities. The journals of the North Carolina Council for June 25, 1713, show negotiations between acting Governor Pollock and the council for the purchase of a number of Indians for shipment to the West Indies. For what? For shipment to the West Indies. It was sometimes a problem to provide for the captured Indians. Consequently, in the same year, the Assembly chartered a private sloop to carry away captives brought by friendly Indians. In South Carolina, the Indian captives taken in early war with the Cusco were sold as slaves by governor and council with the sanction of the proprietors, who, though they had forbidden the enslavement of Indians in the temporary laws sent out to the governor's sale in 1671, were nevertheless the first to grant the privilege of selling Indian captives from Carolina to the West Indies, as the cheapest means of encouraging the soldiers of the infant colony. Accordingly, when war broke out with the Stono Indians in 1680, Governor West, taking advantage of the precedent already established and the express sanction of the proprietors for such an action, offered a price for every Indian that should be taken and brought to Charleston, and obtained the funds he needed for defense by selling the Indians to the traders. Who were these traders? Right? The plan proved successful, so successful, in fact, as to arouse the jealousy of the proprietors, for West appropriated some of the profits for his own benefit. The proprietors sanctioned the sale of Indians taken in actual warfare for the benefit of the colony, which meant for their own benefit. The title to the colony rested upon the claims of England to this territory by right of conquest. The Indians were the captives and the conquered people of that conquest. By the rules of war, the conquered people were at the mercy and disposal of the conquerors. And since the proprietors found more profits in selling than in killing the captive Indians, they naturally resented West taking their profits for other purposes. All right, so you hear all what's going on in between their little beefs. Again, we got this before. This is another book we've gone over. It's called the 19th Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, 1897 to 98 by J.W. Powell. All right, so we're on this page where it says, in regard to the contact between the two races, by which such stories could be borrowed from one by the other, it is not commonly known that in all the southern colonies, Indian slaves were bought and sold and kept in servitude, again, servitude, and worked in the fields side by side with Negroes or so-called Negroes, other American Indians, up to the time of the Revolution. Not to go back to the Spanish period, when such things were the order of the day, enslaving American Indians, putting them in encomiendas or servitude. We find the Cherokee as early as 1693 complaining that their people were being kidnapped by slave hunters. Hundreds of captured Tuscarora and nearly the whole tribe of the Appalachians were distributed as slaves among the Carolina colonists in the early part of the 18th century, while the Natchez and others shared similar fate in Louisiana, and as late as least as 1776 Cherokee prisoners of war were still sold to the highest bidder for the same purpose. At one time it was charged against the governor of South Carolina that he was provoking a general Indian war by his encouragement of slave hunts. Furthermore, as the coast tribes dwindled, they were compelled to associate and intermarry with the Negroes, so-called Negroes, right? Until they finally lost their identity and were classed with that race. So American Indians became Negroes. They're telling you right now they were classed with that race. So that a considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negroes is unquestionably Indian owner. Continuing the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times within the present limits of the United States, says here, as a part of the preparation for self-defense made by South Carolina in 1707 and 1708, acts were passed giving the commanding officer of any expedition the power of commissioner to buy all prisoners of the Indian enemy above the age of 12 years that should be taken captive by the white forces or the Indian allies. The slaves so bought were to be delivered to the public receiver, who was directed to pay for them not to exceed the sum of £7 for every Indian, and then to ship them to the islands of the West Indies for sale. Where? To the West Indies. Indian slaves from Caribana trade and labor in the 17th century Caribbean. And it says here, the rebellion of Metacom, King Philip's War, 1676-1678, against New England had united multiple indigenous nations. News of this united rebellion created paranoia among the Barbados Assembly, representing the interests of a large plantation owners, about importing Native Americans as slaves to Barbados, as they might incite similar revolts against the colonists. The Barbados legislators did not aim to prevent the import of all Indian slaves, however, but only the Indians from New England, New York, and Rhode Island who were known to be notorious vigilantes and obstinate, incorrigible rogues and cunning thieves. It would not be until 1688 that the Barbados Assembly decided to outlaw the importation of all Indian slaves to Barbados, which suggests that routes and means of acquiring Indian slaves, apart from connections to North America, had been operating without major opposition for a long time prior to this legislation. All right, did you hear that? Indian slavery was being practiced and operating way before 1688, all right, without major opposition for a long time. Indian slaves from New England and New Netherland, or New York, right, had indeed been a part of the English and Dutch Caribbean landscape since the early 17th century, the early 1600s, meaning 15, even the late 1590s, right? Because going into 1600, right? In Bermuda, English, Providence Island, and we got Providence Island, that's off the coast of Nicaragua and Honduras. They were sending Pequots over there, calling them cannibal Negroes. All right, enslaving the Pequots and sending them to Providence Island, another pilgrim colony, the one they don't teach you about, and Curaçao, Dutch. However, it is unclear how many Indian slaves from North America were in Barbados itself at the time of the 1676 and 1688 acts. In most instances, historians have used sources from New England saying that these captives were sent to the West Indies. All right, West Indies. Historians have guessed that they went to Barbados, since it was the largest recipient of slaves in the English Atlantic for most of the 17th century. For this dissertation, the records reviewed of Indian slaves in Barbados and Suriname do not provide irrefutable evidence of this matter either, since they conflate the origins of all native peoples of the Americas into one category, Indian, or they note that there are other slaves within it, the list of Negroes. All right, so as you can see, none of these deeds or records says Africans. I hope you've noticed in that. All right, so it's Indian, Negroes, and other slaves. They never say Africans really in those times, without indicating who or how many of these others were. Right, so they're basically letting you know you can't really know what tribes were there, what native, American natives were being enslaved from where, what specific places of Americas, because they were just listing them as Indians or Negroes or other slaves. And she's telling you right now, this lady who wrote this paper, these things, they're not indicating who or how many of these others were. They're not really indicating, specifics. Consequently, calculating the exact demographics of Indian slaves on the island, as Jerome S. Handler has noted, is an impossibility. Despite the challenge, identifying the origins of the Indian slaves of Barbados reveals how indigenous people throughout the Caribbean influenced colonization, both on Barbados and through Barbados' influence throughout the Americas. The evidence presented in this dissertation shows that we must start our investigation of Indian slavery more locally, as Worsley suggested, within the Caribbean itself. All right, she's letting you know, if you really want to see foundational truth, you have to really search more locally, not from and over there in Africa, but locally, as Worsley suggested, within the Caribbean itself. They were enslaving American Indians. My dissertation reveals the context for Indian rebellions, both feared and real, through a narrative of colonial indigenous trade and enslavement in the Caribbean since the 1580s, leading up to the period of the 1670s and 1680s, when colonial legislatures began limiting the trade in Indian slaves. This legislation appeared in Barbados, in colonies founded by Barbadians. In Carolina, Allen Galley describes the 1680s as a period when the legislature there began to publish and distribute regulations against keeping Indian slaves. They also proposed penalties against colonists interfering with Indian embassies, and instructed the government and council to establish a commission to meet at least every 2 months in Charlestown
to hear all complaints. These laws eventually failed, however, as the colonial legislature did not have the resources to enforce them, nor necessarily the will of the people. Galley suggests that the Indian captives exported from Carolina from the late 17th century through the 18th century most likely ended up in Barbados. Again, they'll tell us in history books and when we go read about sugar plantations and all that in Barbados, Jamaica, all that, they'll always keep telling us that they kept getting slaves from West Africa. But when we do the research, through this, through the history, follow the trail, you'll see that in these sources, in these original sources, nobody's talking about Africans, and you'll see that it's actually more American Indians being taken to these places for hundreds of years, at the thousands. All right. Because of the strong trade connections between the two colonies and Barbados' insatiable demand for slaves during this period, however, Galley acknowledges that import records for Barbados do not exist to verify this. My research corroborates that Barbados did indeed have precedents of receiving Indian slaves, but I have only found evidence that they were from the circum-Caribbean region prior to the 1670s, and Caribbean Indians probably continued to be the majority of Indian slaves in Barbados because of the aforementioned legislation preventing North American imports in 1676 and 1687. This dissertation shows that Barbados may not have imported North American Indian slaves before this period, but it did export the tradition of subsuming indigenous people within the category of Negroes, Indians, and other slaves into the black coats to North American colonies, making Indians, particularly Carib Indians, subject to an imposed racial identity. They were calling these Carib Indians what? Negroes, Indians, or other slaves. Negroes, black coats. All right, and it's titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. At meeting of the Plymouth Court in 1676, to consider the disposal of more than 100 captives, the conclusion was reached, upon serious and deliberate consideration and agitation, conquering them, to sell the greater number into servitude. Again, into what? Servitude. A little later, in the same year, several more were sold. In each case, the colonial treasurer was ordered to effect the sale for the benefit of the colony. A fiscal report of Plymouth for the period from June 25, 1675 to September 23, 1676, gives among the credits the following, which relates to the sale of the 188 Indians already mentioned, by the following accounts received in or as silver. Captives for 188 prisoners at war sold. Prisoners of war sold. Remember where they took these prisoners, right? They took them to Spain. Prisoners of war, Spain. Records of similar events are found in Massachusetts Bay. On November 4th, 1676, the magistrates and deputies adopted a report of committee of the General Court providing for the selling abroad of several Indians. Again, on September 16, 1676, the General Court passed an act for handing over the disposal of certain captured Indians to the Council. The General Court expressed the opinion that such of them had shed English blood should suffer death. The inference concerning the remainder is that they were to be sold. Continuing in the book, Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States, says here the colonial governments not only sold the Indian captives themselves, but sometimes authorized their military commanders so to do. On January 15, 1676, the governor of Massachusetts issued instructions to Captain Benjamin Church to go against the Indians and to distribute among his men the plunder and captives according to such agreement as captain and company might make. The instructions read, "And it shall be lawful, and is hereby warranted, for him to make sale of such prisoners as their perpetual slaves, or otherwise to retain them as they think meet, they being such as the law allows to be kept,
On August 28, 1676, also, the governor of Plymouth wrote to the governor of Rhode Island that Captain Church had been chosen and authorized by Plymouth to demand and receive of the governor of Rhode Island all the captive Indians and to guard and conduct them to Plymouth, or to sell and dispose of them, as he chose, to the inhabitants or others for terms of life, or for shorter terms, as there may be reasons. No exception to this custom of enslavement was made in the case of the praying Indians. During the course of the war, several of these Indians, through the harsh dealings of the English, and because of neglect to provide them with sufficient shelter, protection, and encouragement, joined the warring Indians. Such of these Indians as were taken in arms were declared by the Massachusetts General Court to be in rebellion and were tried and sentenced, some to be killed, but the most of them to be transported and sold as slaves.
Peru.
The same method of obtaining cheap labor was followed by the colonists. Frequent raids were made upon the rancherias or Indian settlements to secure agricultural workers, herdsmen, and domestic servants. Children were usually in demand, but adults were also taken. The practice continued indeed until late in the 18th century.
A third region which served as a major source of slaves for Europe and Africa was the coast of Brazil. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, sailing to India, touched along the Brazilian coast. It appeared that at least one American was sent back to Portugal with Gaspar de Lemos. This initially friendly contact was not to last, however, since the King of Portugal seems to have envisioned the coast of Brazil as a second slave coast. He let a contract to Fernão de Noronha and a company of merchants to trade in Brazil wood and slaves. They were to send to Brazil 6 ships each year. 4 ships were sent in 1503 and they returned to Portugal full of wood and slaves. It is known that the trade was fairly regular after 1504. From the very beginning, then, Americans were acquired as a commodity and shipped to Europe, as well as perhaps to Africa. Portuguese slavers may have also ventured into regions claimed by Spain. In July 1503, a letter reached the Spanish court with the news that Portuguese ships had gone to the area discovered by Rodrigo Bastidas, part of Colombia and Panama, y traído esclavos, indios y palo de Brasil, and it says, and carried off American slaves in Brazil. In 1511, the Portuguese ship Bertoa, with 2 Negroes and 1 non-Negro slave on board, carried some 35 American slaves from Brazil to Portugal. Another ship in the following year was described as having the deck loaded with young men and women. From then on there, a frequent report of Americans being taken to Portugal, some for showing to the king and some for more ordinary servitude, as Capistrano de Abreu noted. The Portuguese crown in 1530s authorized the creation of about 12 feudal dominions in Brazil. Each of the grantees donatarios was entitled to enslave as many Americans as were needed for local labor, but only 24 per year, 48 for one donatorio, could be sent to Portugal by each for sale. This authorization continued until 1549 and allowed about 216 slaves to be sent each year for some 15 years, for a potential total of 3,240 or more. Of course, Portuguese laws were frequently not enforced in the colonial areas, and many more slaves have actually been transported, especially since American slaves could legally be used without limit to man the ships for the passage to Portugal. The Portuguese began quite early to try to find markets for Brazilians outside of the Portuguese Empire. In 1538, 3 Portuguese ships reached Borinquen with 45 Portuguese and 140 American slaves, and a few free Americans. So there was, they say they reached Puerto Rico, Borinquen. A Portuguese captain later proposed to ship Brazilian slaves to Haiti, and initially 6 or 7 were sent. So you see that all these, they say that they were bringing Africans, the Spanish and Portuguese were bringing Africans to the Caribbean, and from there to the English were taking them and bringing them to America. These were from other parts of America. These were Native Americans they were bringing there by the thousands from South America, Central America, wherever they were grabbing them. In 1550, however, Charles V resolved not to allow the introduction of Brazilians as slaves. Some years later, a Portuguese ship reached the island of Margarita with 300 American male and female slaves. They were sold, but in 1556 the Spanish crown ordered the guilty to be punished for violating the law. On the other hand, in 1570 consideration was given to authorizing the importation into Spanish colonies of Brazilian slaves enslaved by other Americans. This category of slave, as well as Caribes, that is, alleged cannibals, could be imported. In any case, one can see that between 1530s and 1570s, the Portuguese were actively attempting to market American slaves far and wide. Okay, you hear that? So within Brazil, the enslavement of Americans proceeded very rapidly, primarily for the use in sugarcane and cotton industries. You hear that? Caribbean. Later on, the donatorios between 1535 and 1550 document this process, as in 1545 when Pedro de Goes wrote to the king that in the fields and sugar refineries of São Tomé there were enough slaves. The population of St. Vincent in 1548 including 600 free persons and more than 3,000 American slaves in 1548, according to a letter of Luis de Goes. So San Vicente, so they tell us that these are Africans they're bringing there. There's 300 American slaves, 3,000 American slaves there already. To the south of Bahia, only American slaves were mentioned as forming the labor force in 1584, especially in the southern and northern parts of Brazil, Sao Paulo, San Vicente, and Maranhão. And in the interior, the enslavement of Americans continued to be a major source of labor for centuries. Between 1630 and 1650, for example, from 100,000 to 200,000 Americans from the Paraguay region were enslaved and sold in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and elsewhere. So if these people, if you see the Paraguay's people of today, they're very light-skinned, most of them. Where are they? If these are the same Paraguay people from back then, where are they? Because when you go to Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and all these parts of Brazil, you're going to see copper-colored people. And you just heard from 1630 to 1650, 100,000 to 200,000 Americans from Paraguay were being taken there and sold as slaves. It says here, in any case, Chief Martin of the Carijo nation complained to the Spanish in 1576 that the Portuguese of southern Brazil were carrying their children off to other parts of Brazil and then to Portugal to be sold as slaves. A Jesuit witnessed in 1635 a slave raid using 15 seagoing ships and many large canoes designed reportedly to secure 12,000 slaves from the Carijo nation. 12,000 slaves. One must suppose that many were to be secured for sale outside of Brazil. We can, I think, be confident that the Americans soon appeared in the Portuguese colonies, in Africa, and in the Cabo Verde Islands. Cabo Verde Islands. The high death rates on Portuguese sailing vessels of the period would make necessary for replenishing of crews in Brazil, and a somewhat later date, the use of the Brazilian natives and mixed bloods in the African trade in various capacities. So you hear this? What I was been saying the whole time? They're saying that be sure that they are using Brazilian natives in the African trade in various capacities, because they were already up in there for hundreds of years, I guess, you can say, basically, in Cabo Verde Island in West Africa.
After 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil, and we can be sure that many persons of American ancestry went there, alright? 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil. It was a colony of Brazil, not the other way around, people. In addition to the normal kinds of contact, Angola was used as a place for sending Americans and other persons who proved troublesome in Brazil. So they were sending rebel Indians, those who were fighting back the Portuguese and Spanish and the Jesuits and all these Christians that were going over there to enslave them and take their things, invade their country, take their land. So they would send all these rebel Indians over to Angola, all right, the troublesome ones, all right. In Ceará, for example, mixed blood and American undesirables were periodically rounded up and shipped off to Angola. 1720s onwards. All right, 1720s, they're supposed to be coming from that side. No, after about 1740, the island of Fernão de Noronha was also used as a dumping ground for such people. All right, this island off the coast of Brazil. In the south of Brazil, Americans and other non-whites were deported to Angola for gold smuggling or for using a route passing through a region exposed to attack by free Americans forces in the 1720s.
Many American slaves were resold from Portugal to other countries. And this trade continued for at least a century, they're saying. So Native Americans were being brought to Portugal and from there resold to other countries. So from there they were telling people that they were African, right? Because they were black. And they're teaching everybody was coming from Africa, all these Negros, so-called Negros, right? So it says in 1592, for example, a widower of Lisbon sold Beatriz, age 12, originally from Pernambuco, Brazil, to the Canary Islands. Many Americans were sold as slaves in Spain, as revealed by the notarial records of Seville and Valencia. It is not possible. It says here, from the 1590s onward, Dutch warships frequently captured Spanish and Portuguese vessels, many of which were loaded with slaves or possessed crew members of non-white race. So we're talking about the American Indians they were grabbing, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese, as we just read all the accounts. Some of these slaves were taken to Europe, while others were sold to the English in Virginia. Alright, here we go. We're starting to get to America now. Or were sent to Dutch ports in the Americas, New Amsterdam, Curacao, for example. New Amsterdam up there in New York, Massachusetts, all that area. We know that some of the captives were persons with Spanish Christian names and were not new slaves from Africa. So they're telling us straight up that they were not Africans. Okay, you're hearing that, right? They weren't African. You already read all the accounts. Now we gotta, the lies that the Americans saying they were grabbing, or these English were grabbing Negroes from the Spanish ships that were coming from Africa, but they weren't. As you can say here, they had Christian names, were not new slaves from Africa. In fact, some of those who arrived in Virginia were Carib people. They were Carib people.
In the article, again, Indian slavery in colonial Georgia, we continue, says, on April 8, 1776, the Georgia Gazette advertised to be sold on Friday the 17th instant at the exchange a handsome young Indian princess. Since Mary Bosworth had already proclaimed herself an Indian princess, the vendue masters Ewing and Bolton doubtless stretched the truth no more than she had done, perhaps in hopes of attracting high bids from local brocels. In 1771, a Spanish fellow, Emmanuel, probably an Indian or a musty from Spanish America, was valued at £60 on the estate of the deceased William Carr, near Sunbury. In 1772, George Galpin, who did his business mostly in Georgia, purchased from trader John Mealy an Indian boy captured by the Tomatli Indians in a raid on a plantation in Pensacola Bay. Two other Indian slaves, both probably Native Americans, attempted to escape and were advertised in the Georgia Gazette as runaways. On February 17, 1768, it advertised for a dark Indian fellow, the property of William Lifford, escaped from the Elizabeth and Mary Captain Samuel Coble's pilot boat. On September 22nd, 1775, it advertised for an Indian slave named Sandy, about 20 years of age, wearing a blue vest with gold gilt buttons and dark breeches with white metal buttons, a brown-colored surtout, a hat and blue and white handkerchief upon his head, an Onax-brig shirt, and a pair of green Negro cloth Indian boots tied with red garters. He speaks very bad Scotch. Advertisements for musties during the period appeared more frequently. The seizure of Indians by authority of the colonial government and their subsequent sale were not always above suspicion. At the time of the Narragansett troubles, in 1646, Plymouth gave legal sanction for the seizure of peaceable and unsuspecting Indians, whose tribes were at peace with the English. A second instance of the same character occurred during King Philip's War, shortly after the destruction of Dartmouth in 1675. The Dartmouth Indians had not been concerned in the burning of the town, so the whites entered into the negotiations of peace and friendship with them.
The captains of the resident militia and the Plymouth forces sent thither promised them protection, but through other influences they were conducted to Plymouth, and by order of the council, August 4th, 1675, they were sold and transported out of the country, being about 80 persons. So you hear that? So these people said, we want to be at peace, we surrender, we do a treaty with you. They still were sold and transported out of the country. Again, when the article Indian slavery in colonial Georgia, and continues, says there were doubtless scores of other Indian slaves in Georgia, perhaps hundreds, for their enslavement persisted throughout the colonial period. In 1738, a trader who had just returned from the Creeks, Chickasaws, and Cherokees assured Pastor Bolsius, or Granau, that these tribes cannot live long without war, and therefore many hostile Indian slaves are bought and sold to the Europeans. In 1772, David Tate, John Stewart, emissary to the Creeks, felt that he had to instruct a Mestisigio, chief of the Little Talasses, not to let his people take in any Indian slaves from the plantations. The sufferings of whites captured by the Indians were often published by the captives soon after they were freed, and have been reprinted in the Garland Library of Narratives of North American Indian Captivities, which include some 311 titles. The sufferings of the Indian slaves who then lacked a written language and were rarely free to learn and use any other remain unchronicled. So again, we're still in the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. Again, this is Studies in History, Economics and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia. In 1708, the Canadian French were exciting the Indians about Kaskaskia to wage war with each other, and were on the spot to get slaves to sell to the English. So they would stir up trouble, make them go to war with each other, and then they would take the captives as prisoners or slaves to sell to the English. So the French were selling American Indians as slaves to the English. These were not Africans. In 1524, accordingly, Verrazano attempted to capture an Indian family consisting of an old woman, a young girl, and 6 children on the northeast coast of North America. All right, we got that in the past videos. We also got in this same account, in this same book from 1524 of Verrazano, he clearly states that these same Indians he was trying to kidnap were black, unlike Ethiopians, right? They were dark skinned. They were so-called Negro. All right, Verrazano said this in 1524. But in this story, when he tried to kidnap him, this continues, he says, but the girl proved so intractable that the soldiers were forced to give up the attempt to take the whole family to the ship, and finally carried away but one small boy who was too young to make any resistance. That's so messed up. Imagine that could be your son they took. In Cartier's first expedition in 1534, he seized some of the natives and carried them on board his ships. Where? On what? On his ships. We're just talking about Deuteronomy 28. On ships, right? And continues, says the relations with the Indians were so friendly that he was able, by gifts and explanations, to persuade them that he meant no harm. So you see the evil nature of these people, right? Tricking your ancestors, being all nice to them, and then grabbing them up and enslaving them. 2 of them were finally detained on board and carried to France. Carried where? To France, to Europe. On the second expedition in 1535, Cartier, replying to the request of the chief Taiguragui that the French carry away another chief, Agona, declared that the king of France had forbidden him to bring back either man or woman, and permitted him to bring to France only 2 or 3 little boys to learn the language. But these pretended instructions did not prevent Cartier from seizing Taiguragui and other chiefs for the purpose of carrying them to France. Chiefs! Oh. I'm reading from the book now called Columbus and Other Cannibals, the Wetico Disease of Exploitation. And it says here, after learning of the reported existence of so-called Carib people who allegedly ate human flesh, Columbus developed plans for their large-scale enslavement. the Caribs, after correction, would be better than any other slaves whatsoever. Again, remember, Columbus said that they would make perfect slaves. On January 30, 1494, Columbus proposed to the Spanish crown that the enslavement of Americans would pay for the cost of the conquest. We got this on the first part of this enslavement video, right? Colon and his compatriots first began to enslave Taino, Arawak people who were neither cannibalistic nor warlike. All right, they weren't even cannibalistic. Lacaze's notes, he will finish in very short time, consuming all the people of this island, Haiti, because he was determined to load the ships, which would go to the Castile, with slaves and to send them to sell to the Canary and Azores and Cabo Verde Islands. Again, Cabo Verde Islands. This is before John Hawkins arrived to Cabo Verde to kidnap the so-called Negros there. Again, they were grabbing Columbus and all these Spaniards. As soon as they got here, were grabbing and sending them to Castile, to Spain, to Cabo Verde, to Canary Islands, to the Azores. All right, way before 1562.
So lies my teacher told me corresponds to what we were just talking about, which says in 1501 the Portuguese began to depopulate Labrador, transporting the now extinct Botoc Indians to Europe and Cape Verde as slaves.
Again, they brought Indians, American Indians, to Cape Verde as slaves from Newfoundland and Canada, or that area they used to call Terra Nova, Labrador. Right? Again, 1501, way before 1562, right? When John Hawkins went to Cape Verde. So, before John Hawkins went to Cape Verde, the Botoc had already been taken, enslaved, and sent to Cape Verde as slaves. Do the research.
It says here, after being expelled from Brazil in 1654, the Dutch, or many of them, and the Portuguese Jews who had joined them, retreated with slaves. Again, Portuguese Jews. And they retreated with slaves, servants, and a plantation ideology to other places. And they're talking about other places in America. For example, 900 such persons, free and slave, left Brazil and migrated to Guadeloupe and Martinique. In addition, the Dutch had been actively selling slaves in the French islands, as noted. We know that many of the slaves on the islands were Brazilians, okay, not Africans. Americans from Brazil and Arawakis, or Arawaks, perhaps from the Guyana coast, Guyana, in South America. In 1656, some 20 Brazilian slaves helped suppress an Angolan rebellion on Guadeloupe. As late as 1767, the Brazilian term Mamaluco was still being used on Martinique. The Dutch, along with the French and English, were active along the Guyana coast, and that's in South America again, during this same period. The Dutch in particular developed for a time a route from the Essequibo River via the Rio Negro. Again, Rio Negro, that's the real name of the Amazon. It was originally called the River Niger, or Negro, to the Amazon, bringing back canoe loads of slaves to the coast from the Amazon, slaves not from Africa. They made peace with the Locono, Arawak people of Suriname, and by the late 1680s with the adjacent Carib groups. The friendly tribes, especially the Caribs, continued to supply the Dutch with American slaves from the interior until the mid-19th century. The island of Curaçao was also used by the Dutch as a center for the resale of slaves, and it would appear that Americans were still being obtained along the wild coast of South America well into the 19th century. That's the 1800s. All right, so they're letting you know, all right, that the Dutch were enslaving American Indians since the 1500s all the way up into the 1800s, 300 years. How many of them? Thousands and thousands, right? Who was keeping track, really? The ultimate disposition of the American slaves from the Suriname, Orinoco, Amazon watersheds, and the Curaçao region is not known to me. Some Suriname area natives were sent to Barbados from 1627 to help develop the sugar industry there. Perhaps others were sold with black Africans. let's touch the hijack, to all available markets or were taken to Dutch colonies in Africa and elsewhere. Again, taken to Dutch colonies in Africa and elsewhere. Do you know the Dutch colonies in Africa, what those countries are? Yes. All right. So a lot of Americans were taken to those countries. During all this period, Americans were held as slaves or were being enslaved in Brazil. This was true in the Amazonian region, where Native American labor was in constant demand for the Para-Sierra area. One Jesuit estimated that 3 million Indians were descended as slaves from the Rio Negro alone. We're talking about the Amazon when they say Rio Negro. In the century up to 1750, 3 million Indians. While this figure may be exaggerated, there is no question but that some Portuguese possessed more than 1,000 American slaves each. 1,000 slaves each, American slaves, not Africans. The Bishop of Bahia in Brazil in 1827 noted that 20,000 Americans in his province were suited to all kinds of work and industry. Another speaker mentioned 200,000 who can immediately settle Brazil. In the middle of the 19th century, a British visitor to the Guyana-Suriname region noted how prevalent the Indian slave trade has been and how recently carried on, even without our boundaries. It still prevails on the southern borders of our colony and the northern tributaries of the Amazon. He noted further that Makusi of the interior were especially victimized. The Brazilians as well as the Caribs, Acawoyos, etc., have long been in the habit of enslaving them. Slavery also continued in other sections of Brazil. In 1741, some 8,000 Kai'apo people of Goiás were enslaved. 8,000 Kai'apo people of Goiás were enslaved. Large numbers of carijos, servants, were present in the south, sometimes classified as administered Indians, but in practice used in servile status. Okay? These are Indians, not Africans. In the Spanish Empire and the independent republics established therefrom, slavery or semi-slavery also continued from the late 17th through the 19th century, in spite of laws prohibiting such. Along the northern frontier of Mexico, slavery continued during the 1690s and persisted until the 1860s, primarily involving Apaches, Navajos, Pauites, Javapais, and other border nations, whose resistance made them subject to being captured. Some natives from this region were shipped to the West Indies. Again, so all these tribes, right? Apaches, Navajos, Pauites, Javapais. Some of these were shipped where? To the West Indies. Who's arriving at the West Indies? Not Africans. More American natives. While others, such as the Yaqui, in the 1880s were sold to Yucatan. The Yaqui ended up in the Yucatan, Mexico. After the abortive Tupac Amaru rebellion in Peru in 1781, yes, there was a guy named Tupac Amaru who led a rebellion in Peru in the 1780s. However, the Inca nobility suspected of disloyalty to Spain were executed, imprisoned, or shipped to exile in Spanish Sahara. They sent them to North Africa. What? Incas, Tupac Amaru's people, to the Spanish Sahara. Thus, some Americans reached till another part of Africa. You see all what's going on. It's in reverse. The great purpose of the French in the New World was trade. All right, trade. All right, but we're starting to realize it was basically slave trade. Not just the word trade like we're thinking, oh, they were trading fur, spices, fruits, whatever. No, it was human cargo, slave trade. All right, they're leaving a word out of this. Their expeditions, excluding those of the missionaries, were commercial in nature. Commercial. Key words here. With them, gold hunting was not a primary consideration. They didn't care about gold, nor were they seeking a refuge from persecution. like the English. The great fur trade was being developed by them. This trade was carried on with the Indians, and in all sections were captives in war or kidnapped Indians were purchased from the natives. Such purchase was usually a part of the trade in furs. The custom of purchasing Indians originated with the early explorers and discoverers purchasing Indians. We ain't talking about Africans being purchased here. De Bourgmont sent some of those whom he purchased back to New Orleans. La Vérendrye also in 1731 sent back slaves to French settlements, and in writing of his action implied that he thought he deserved much credit for furnishing the colonists with slaves. All right, so again, all these slaves, they're not African. The French are enslaving your ancestors. Until well into the latter half of the 18th century, Indian slaves were held by the settlers of Detroit, who obtained them in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. All right, Indian slaves were held in Detroit. In 1741, the so-called Nation of the Serpent entirely destroyed 17 villages, killed all the men and older women, made slaves of the young women, and traded them for horses and other merchandise. A report to the home government in 1720 concerning Natchitoches declared that the most extensive commerce which could be carried on with the Indians of that section would be in slaves, horses, skins, etc. Okay, so again, the French were here mainly for trade, and their venture was mainly commercial purposes, and the primary thing helping this was slaves, American Indian slavery, workforce, free labor. Another report sent by Lascelles told of the Alabama Indians bringing 27 or 28 mobile Indian women and children into the colony and disposing of them to the French. The friendly and allied Indians appreciated the results to be obtained from the sale of their captives to the whites, and not only sold them to the couriers de bois and other traveling traders, but took them directly to the French settlement for sale, as is shown in the preceding paragraph. So can you imagine in these times, all these, this was a big hustle. Like, think about it, man. Apparently, all the leading French settlements afforded a ready market for such slaves. Again, apparently, all the leading French settlements, all right, afforded a ready market for such slaves. All these French colonies, settlements in America were basically taking in American Indian slaves. Mostly not Africans. Show us the African records. All right, there is a real history being told here and recorded. Mobile furnishes a case in point. On November 1706, a party of Wacha arrived in the settlement, bringing some Abenaki captives for sale. In the same month, also some Choctaw brought to the settlement Kawita and Altamaha captives for the same purpose. All right, so everybody was in the game, whether it was for survival or whatever, but a lot of the tribes were doing it to each other. All right, and it's interesting, this tribal name Kawita, because we got a town in our indigenous region called Talamanca in Costa Rica called Kawita. The colonists favored the same action for a more commercial reason. The French of Kaskaskia in 1708 were urging the allied Indians to war and were on the spot to obtain captives to sell as slaves to the English. De Vaudreuil, Governor General of Canada, throughout the first quarter of the 18th century was urging the Abenaki to wage war on the Illinois to obtain slaves for him. An important factor in the French colonial trade was the courriers de bois. These men, having cut loose from civilization, wandered at will among the Indians, trading for the various commodities which they could dispose of in the settlements of either the French or English colonies. All right, so they say trade. We got to have the open quotes, close quotes, trade. Right, they were basically slavers. Most of them. That was the real hustle. That was the real, like in today, that would be the money. All right, one of these commodities was Indian slaves. Okay, one of these commodities is the major commodity. You are the gold, obtained for the most part from the tribes who had captured them in war. Judging from the number of these white men of the woods, their unrestrained life, and the evidence given by the men of the time, it seems not unlikely that this feature of colonial trade produced a considerable portion of Indian slaves used by the French. If the coureurs de bois did not find a sufficient number of slaves among the tribes they visited, they not infrequently stirred up the tribes to war, so that they might obtain the captives for sale. Some of the most prominent ones were engaged in this same slave trade with the English. Again, these French colonial officials, the most prominent ones, were actually engaged in this same slave trade, the American Indian slave trade. With who? With the English. Both of them enslaving American Indians. They're not getting them from Africa. And when appearing to be opposed to it, in 1708, Bienville ordered the Canadian French to cease exciting the Indians of Kaskaskia to wage war on each other to obtain slaves for them. Yet in the same year he proposed, since the French would not cultivate the land, to obtain the needful supply of labor by seizing Indians and sending them to the West Indies in exchange for Negroes or other American Indians. Keyword, they say Negroes, right? They don't say Africans. The slave trade had evidently become enough of a problem in the plains by the late 1710s that French officials identified it as their primary obstacle to commercial and political expansion. In 1717, François de Lemarie, a priest who had served for nearly a decade in the settlement of Mobile, composed a memoir on Louisiana in which he recommended that the French crown outlaw the Indian slave trade in the Great Plains. It was so major, it was affecting so much what was going on, right? They wanted to control it, really. That's what they really wanted to do, right? So they wanted to outlaw it supposedly because it was so major, right? Indian slave trade this is not Africans. Again, Indian slave trade. He specifically condemned those coureurs de bois, the coureurs de bois like Poudret, who bought and sold slaves of Paducas and other peoples of the Missouri. A ban on the slave trade would, he concluded, cut at the root the wars that the Indians only continue between themselves because of the advantageous sale that they make of their captives to the traders, who then resell them in this colony to the Spanish and to the vessels that come to our port for selling them a third time to the islands. All right, who were they giving the Spanish, and who was going to these islands in the West Indies? American Indians, not Africans. All right, there was a whole circle of slave trade, right? We're starting to see, right? Is it starting to add up to you? In the simpler life of the inhabitants of the Illinois country, agriculture was the chief industry of the settlers until the close of the period under discussion, and the farmers increased the results of their industry by the extensive use of Indian slaves. All right, not African slaves, Indians slaves. Throughout the French territory, in the military stations, both soldiers and frontiersmen found use for their Indian women slaves as cooks and in performing the other domestic labors of fort and camp. The male slaves were used in erecting fortifications. You build their towers, you build their municipalities, their government buildings, their town halls, their city halls. You build it. Performing other heavy labor and as guides in military expeditions. Marriage between French and Indians was common. All right, so marriage between French and Indians. All right, so not Africans, slaves, right? Because then we know about what they start saying, mulattoes, right?
and how these French colonies, the French were marrying with the slave girls who are supposed to be right African descendants, but they were really marrying so-called Negro girls, right? But they were Indians. So French marriage between French and Indians was common. The social result of these close connections was more pronounced in case of the Frenchman than in that of the Indian. It meant that Indianizing of the Frenchman, or the bringing him to the social level, into the life and habits of the red man. He took on your ways, copper-colored tribe. The Louisiana church records certain accounts of the birth, baptism, marriage, and burial of Indian slaves. All right, not African slaves. The Mobile and New Orleans registers are similar to the church registers to be found throughout Lower Canada, wherever a church was established. All right, so all these places, the records, the registers, similar, right? It was Indian slaves, Indians raised. In the early history of Vincennes, most of the slaves were Indians, for the inhabitants were more extensively engaged in the Indian trade than in agricultural pursuits. The same was true of the country about Detroit. Again, Indian slaves, all right? Mostly Indian slaves in Detroit, not Africans. Indian slaves, mostly children, are recorded in Detroit in 1710, 1712, and 1715. Their use continued there until the English occupation. All right, Indian slave children. A report in 1733 shows that the Canadians trading in Indian slaves whom they seized or purchased from other Indians.
A burden strapped to tie my binds. The fear of waters I have never seen in my dreams. Dressed of courage to face my captors. Give me a rattle to sing my death song. For even if I live, I will taste no more the sweet pumpkin, the roasted corn, and soft beans. I will smell no more the scent of familiar woods and smoked hickory. My greased up hair will shine no more under the rays of a friendly sun. Give me a rattle to sing my death song, because no one will remember my name over the days to come.
Almost like the pieces of a broken puzzle, the history of Native American slavery has, for many years, lied dormant in scattered church records, wills, trade transactions, and footnotes of colonial legislations. This business was initiated by the Spanish just a year after Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492. Although it was lost to official versions of history, it was never forgotten by the descendants of the thousands of indigenous men, women, and children that were forcibly made to work for unknown masters in Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. Up until the mid-18th century, every colonial power that competed for the supremacy of North America used indigenous slaves for mines, fields, and construction work. This pre-African slavery experienced by the indigenous Americans at the hands of the French, the English, and the Spanish followed the vagaries of political and economic interests at the core of very different colonial strategies.
If you want to understand the beginnings of Native American slavery, you have to understand the juxtaposition of the three European colonizing strategies in North America. And they were the fur trade in the Northeast, the plantation system in the South, and the Spanish mission system in Florida.
The trade in Indian slaves connected these three colonial strategies. As northern wars for fur hunting territories sent displaced Indian groups to the south, local plantation owners armed them to hunt for slaves amongst the tribes living in the Spanish Florida missions.
One of the most poignant examples of the disruption of Indian slavery on native groups can be seen through the Appalachian Indians. When the English colony of Carolina developed in 1670, very shortly afterwards, the Appalachee became a primary target for Indian slave raids from Carolina. By 1704, the mission was devastated by these slave raids, and many Appalachee were killed. A vast majority of the remaining Appalachee were sold into slavery in Cuba.
No sign remained of the Appalachies' flourishing culture after the incursions of the English and Indian slave traders. Their temples were burned down, their magnificent council houses were destroyed, and their fields were abandoned. What was once a powerful nation of more than 6,000 people was reduced to a handful of scattered survivors. The trade in slaves proved to be so profitable that Carolina's English and Scottish slavers and their Indian allies pushed themselves deep into Spanish and French territories to hunt for captives. In a letter to Charles Spencer, Earl of Sunderland, written by Thomas Nairn from South Carolina on July 10, 1708, we learn,
Your lordship may perceive by the map that the garrison of St. Augustine is by this war reduced to the bare walls. Their cattle and Indian towns all consumed either by us in our invasion of that place, or by our Indian subjects, since who, in quest of booty, are now obliged to go down as far on the point of Florida as the firm land will permit. They have drove the Floridians to the islands of the Cape, have brought in and sold many hundreds of them, and daily reduce these barbarians to a far less number. There is not one Indian town betwixt Charlestown and Mobile Bay, except what are pricked in the map. Only am uncertain of the numbers of the Floridians. Our friends, the Talapuis and the Chickasaw, employ themselves in making slaves of such Indians about the lower parts of the Mississippi, as are now subject to the French. The good prices the English traders give them for slaves encourages them to this trade extremely, and some men think that it both serves to lessen their numbers before the French can arm them, and it is a more effectual way of civilizing and instructing than all the efforts used by the French missionaries.
the trade in Indian slaves was a vast enterprise that stretched from as far west as Spanish New Mexico to as far north as the Great Lakes. Virtually every tribe living in this large area was involved in this commerce either as a supplier of captives or as middlemen.
The Caddo traded Lipan Apache, but the Caddo don't really seem to keep slaves. They just kind of trade. It's down the line trade, so to speak. After that, where you have the first count of slaves is more people like from lower Louisiana, the Washoe, the Chawasha, the Chitamacha, people like that go into Mobile. By the time they're settled up here and the system is well entrenched in the French trading system, the primary source of slaves is coming from the West.
Many indigenous nations suffered due to enslavement. On the Atlantic seaboard, entire tribes were sold into slavery to the Caribbean.
A compelling example of Indians being sold into slavery in Virginia that's often overlooked is what happened to the Nansadeco people in 1704. That's actually the one instance that we have where a tribe was essentially eliminated as a result of a conflict here. And a small party of those Nansadeco Indians committed a killing of one family, the John Rowley family. But what happened as a result, the Nansadeco were impugned to give up the killers, and they did that. And the killers were convicted in English court, and they were hanged. But the General Assembly also decided that the entire nation could be retaliated against because of what these men had done. So they actually passed a ruling that enslaved the entire population of the Nansadeco, with the exception of children that were under 12. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua in the West Indies.
Other than being a convenient source of free labor, The enslavement and deportation of Indians to the Caribbean was part of a systematic plan to eliminate the native presence from the emerging colonies.
The year 1636 was part of that war with the Pequot tribe. The turning point was when over 300 men, women, and children were burned alive in fort at Mystic, Connecticut. The native people that had not been slaughtered were put into slavery, and either in the other tribes who assisted the English in that war, or they were enslaved by the English themselves and sold out of the country in fairly large numbers. And they were sent to various places, and one of the favorite destinations was Bermuda.
Indian slaves were shipped from ports such as Mobile and New Orleans. Whilst the English sent them to Barbados, the French sent them to Martinique and Guadeloupe, and the Dutch sent them to their domains in the Antilles.
Few of us understand that there was also a middle passage from the Americas to the Bahamas, which were the breaking grounds for the slaves, but also to New England, where the markets were. There were some that were sent back to Europe. The very first ones that were sent back to Europe were the property of the king, the queen, and the church. And so, interestingly enough, many of the first Indian slaves were taken back to become, wards of the state and the property of the people there.
Whilst undeniably a minority, dozens, perhaps hundreds of Native Americans crossed the Atlantic, reaching Europe as slaves. A rare proof of this is the case of John Panis, a Native American child whose tombstone is still visible in Kent, England.
We know very little about John Panis, apart from the fact that we have his tombstone in Hayes churchyard. Now, in 1754, William Pitt had moved to Hayes, and by the end of the decade, he was actually virtually in charge of the government at a time when Britain was having various military successes all over the world. John Panis may have been given as a gift from someone who was pleased with the successes that were being achieved and was brought to England and became a servant in his household, or possibly for his children, because by 1763, William Pitt had 5 children. A number of people have been suggested as possibly the people that may have given William Pitt John Panis as a gift. Perhaps Benjamin Franklin, or possibly General Forbes, who captured the fort that has since become known as Pittsburgh. Or he may be one of the wealthy merchants who had connections with the West Indian plantations, where they had slaves. And one candidate is William Beckford, who became Lord Mayor of London, who was very grateful for Pitt's support for him when there was a question that they might put taxes on sugar. We can only imagine what horrendous journey he might have had. The sea voyage, possibly sea sickness. It's difficult to imagine how he felt when he arrived in a strange country with different customs, different culture, different language, different clothes. He would have felt very strange, I think. We don't really know why he was buried in Hayes Church, or indeed how he died. He must have succumbed to some illness, or possibly it was winter time, perhaps it was smallpox, or it could have been an epidemic, or some European disease he was not used to. Unfortunately, the burial records for that period do not survive. So we can't tell if there was an epidemic in the area. Of the 650 odd burials that took place in Hayes Church in the 18th century, 15 memorial stones survive. One of those is John Panis's, so he must have been regarded with some consideration to actually have had a headstone erected for him.
Between 1650 and the beginnings of the 18th century, As many as 50,000 Indian slaves had been sold by the English alone to their colonial outposts in the Caribbean. But these numbers are incomplete because many transactions were unrecorded due to the heavy taxation put on slave cargoes. What is more, the fact that slave records almost exclusively mention European names makes it difficult to establish the ethnicity of the people traded.
For the most part, the greatest source of information comes from the Catholic Church records. And they very rarely have even ethnicity, much less prior name. The names they take are Catholic names. So you have Mary Ann and Marie Therese and, Jean de la Grande-Terre and whomever.
Clearly, there are records that establish that Indians were enslaved as early as the first half of the 17th century, quite more frequently in the second half of the 17th century.
First of all, here in our own territory, if we were made slaves, we had the recourse of running away to our communities, which frequently happened, or to other communities that would give us shelter.
Such was the trouble Indians caused that even colonial outposts such as Barbados called for an end to the deportation of Indians from North America. In 1676, Barbados issued an act that prohibited the importation of Indian slaves.
This act is passed to prevent the bringing of Indian slaves, and as well as to send away and transport those already brought to this island from New England and the adjacent colonies, being thought a people of too subtle, bloody, and dangerous inclination to be and remain here.
Former names were replaced by new ones that gradually left behind a past encoded in elder stories to make room for novel identities. Mixed-race offspring soon became people of color, and Indians gradually disappeared from the records of history.
The English found what they could not accomplish with the torch and the gun, they could accomplish with the stroke of the pen. So that's why they mislabeled our people racially in the records more and more as time went on, until eventually there was no Indian presence in the records. There was never that designation. You were identified as mulatto, musty, or any of those other terms rather than Indian.
Such was the effort to erase Indians from history that up until the early 20th century, scientists of academic institutions deliberately altered census records.
In Virginia, there was a leader of the eugenics movement, a man by the name of Dr. Walter Plecker. He changed records of Virginia Indians that were born and recorded as Indian people to say that they were colored. He did this on birth certificates, marriage certificates, on death certificates, on any legal records that he could get his hands on. So since he physically destroyed or changed records of so many Virginia Indians, he essentially committed an act of bureaucratic genocide on the Virginia Indians. I can't see a more obvious event than what happened in the 20th century in terms of Virginia Indians being written out of history.
Sometimes it got to the point where you were even afraid to say that you were Indian. And you told your children not to because it was safer. And so there were just all these different ways of erasing Native people from the cultural landscapes.
At one point in time, it was a bad thing to even say you were Native American. Some people had to lie on their birth certificates and state that they were either Black or that they were white. So that definitely had an effect on Native American people.
Native people have become the invisible minority here, particularly in the Northeast. The census takers, who were generally white males, made their decision about who was Indian and who was not Indian. And if you did not look Indian, then you didn't get on the census as being Indian. And so those records, whether it was talking about slavery, whether it was talking about indentured servants, it's like putting a 50 million piece puzzle together.